The King's Inheritance. A My Hero Academia fan series. Act 1, The Transfer That Changed Everything. Chapter 1, The Transfer That Changed Everything. The morning Izuku Midoriya arrived at UA High School with a transfer notice tucked under his arm, he was not thinking about fate. He was thinking about whether he had remembered to pack his hero analysis notebooks, whether his shoe locker would be near the stairs, and whether the teachers in Class 1B would look at him the way some teachers always did. That particular expression of careful patience that told him they had already read his file and formed a quiet opinion about the boy who had inherited the most legendary quirk in hero history through means that still made the official documentation awkward to read. The paperwork had come down from Principal Nizu himself. Administrative shuffling, the letter said. A restructuring of resource allocation to ensure optimal development for students showing advanced quirk integration challenges. That was the polite language. The real language, which Izuku had overheard through two closed doors and a badly soundproofed hallway, was that Class 1A had developed what the faculty privately called a pressure ecosystem. 14 months of shared trauma, shared triumph, and shared dorms had fused Class 1A into something so tightly bonded that new developmental challenges were being absorbed and neutralized by group momentum rather than addressed individually. Izuku, as the gravitational center of that momentum, was at once its greatest asset and its most limiting factor for the others. So they were moving him. Kindly. Thoughtfully. Into Class 1B. He stood outside the classroom door for exactly 23 seconds. He counted, because counting was something his brain did when the rest of him was too busy being nervous to function. Through the frosted panel he could hear the low warm murmur of a class settling into morning homeroom, the specific acoustic signature of people who knew each other well and were comfortable in that knowing. He had built that same sound over 14 months in Class 1A. Walking into it as an outsider felt like pressing his ear against the wall of someone else's home. He knocked. He opened the door. 21 faces turned toward him. He registered them in the way he registered everything in the first second of entering a space, a habit burned into him by years of hero analysis and the more recent education of surviving situations where knowing who was in the room could mean the difference between a plan and chaos. 14 months of Class 1A had given him a mental filing system organized by quirk type, combat tendency, and emotional temperature. He began filing the faces in front of him before he had taken his second step into the room. And then the filing system stopped working, because the 21 faces were almost entirely the faces of girls. Not entirely. Kozuya Tsuburaba sat near the window, looking mildly surprised. Senkaibara was beside him with an expression of studied neutrality. Jiroda Shishida occupied the back corner with the patient dignity of someone who had learned to wait. Yosetsu Away sat near the front with his chin propped on his hand, watching Izuku with the open curiosity of someone who had nothing to hide and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. 4 boys. And then, arrayed across the remaining seats in every configuration of personality and posture that Izuku had not had time to catalog yet, 17 girls. Their homeroom teacher, Vlad King, cleared his throat from behind his desk with the energy of a man who had already processed the statistical reality of his classroom composition and arrived at a form of peace with it. He was a large man with a hero's build and a teacher's patience, and he looked at Izuku with what appeared to be genuine warmth. Midoriya, he said. Welcome to Class 1B. You already know the drill. Say something, find a seat, try not to break anything during your first week. There was a scatter of laughter, comfortable and unguarded. It was the laugh of a class that liked their teacher. Izuku felt something in his chest loosen slightly. My name is Izuku Midoriya, he said, because even after everything, public introduction still required him to concentrate on not letting his voice shake. My quirk is one for all. I know that's a lot to drop on a first introduction. I'm still working on not leading with it, but I figure it's better than you finding out later and feeling like I was hiding something. He paused. I'm looking forward to learning alongside you. Another beat of silence, slightly longer than the last. Then Yosetsu Aways raised a hand. You can have Tetsu's old seat, he said. He graduated mid-year. It's by the window and nobody's claimed it because we figured the universe would fill it when it was ready. He said this with complete seriousness. Apparently the universe was waiting for the number one guy in the first-year rankings. I'm not number one, Izuku said, moving toward the indicated seat with the careful navigation of someone trying not to bump into desks. You literally are, said a girl in the second row without looking up from the notebook she was writing in. Her handwriting was extremely small and extremely precise. I checked. Stop being modest about it. It's inefficient. He sat down. Outside the window, the UA ground spread in their particular early autumn palette, the training fields catching the first light, the distant shape of ground gamma rising above the tree line. It looked exactly the same as it had from his old classroom window, but different in the way that the same landscape always looks different from a new angle. He opened his notebook. He began writing. Class 1B, Day 1, he wrote at the top of the page. And then he wrote 17 names he did not yet know, leaving blanks where the faces had not yet resolved into the kind of information he could file properly. By the end of the day, every blank would be filled. He was sure of that. He was good at learning people. He did not know yet that in this particular case, the learning would go considerably further than he intended, or that 17 was a number that would begin, slowly and then all at once, to mean something entirely different than it did on that first morning when it was just a classroom count he had noted in a notebook and filed away under things to figure out later. Chapter 2, The Order of Things. By the end of the first week, Izuku had developed what he privately categorized as a working understanding of Class 1B's social architecture, which was different from Class 1A's in ways that were difficult to articulate but immediately and consistently felt. Class 1A had been built around competing intensities. Katsuki Bakugo's contained explosion of ambition. Shoto Todoroki's carefully managed duality. The way the room's energy had always seemed to organize itself around poles of feeling, hot and cold, loud and silent, and the space between was where everyone else lived. It was a classroom that produced exceptional heroes through the productive friction of exceptional personalities. Class 1B was different. The energy here was more like a river than a storm. It moved with direction and purpose and an underlying current of something that Izuku's notebooks described first as cohesion and later, after more observation, as something warmer and more specific than that. Itsuka Kendo was the class president, and she ran that role with the calm efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed maintaining order not as an exercise of authority but as an act of care. She had a large quirk in the literal sense, her hands capable of expanding to remarkable size, and she used the same quality of scale in her attention, noticing things across the whole room at once, adjusting and supporting and occasionally, with gentle precision, steering people away from decisions they would regret. The boys in the class, Izuku noticed, treated her with a respect that bordered on reverence. The girls treated her like the older sister who had figured out the important things first and was kind enough to share. He had been in the classroom for 2 days when Kendo placed a bento box on his desk during lunch. "You forgot to bring food," she said. It was not a question. "I was going to go to the cafeteria," he said. "The cafeteria line is 20 minutes on Tuesdays. You have a quirk that burns through calories faster than a combustion engine. Eat this." She said it with complete matter-of-factness, the way one might explain a logical solution to a straightforward problem. Then she returned to her own seat. He ate the bento. It was excellent. He wrote a careful thank you note and left it on her desk, because his mother had raised him to acknowledge kindness properly, and he had not unlearned that. The next morning there was a second bento on his desk, and a note in extremely precise small handwriting that said, simply, caloric requirement for OFA quirk users, followed by what appeared to be a genuinely impressive nutritional breakdown. The precise handwriting belonged to Reiko Yanagi, who studied everything with the same focused attention that other people reserved for things they found personally urgent. She was quiet in the specific way that suggested depth rather than absence, and she had a quirk involving psychokinesis that she deployed with an economy of motion that Izuku found professionally fascinating and personally a little intimidating, because there was something particularly striking about someone who could move objects through the air by looking at them with that particular expression of mild interest. Yanagi had apparently, in the 2 days before Izuku arrived, quietly researched the documented caloric and nutritional requirements for quirk users at his power level and produced a multi-page summary that she had never shown anyone, for reasons that she did not explain. She had left the note with Kendo's bento without comment, and Kendo had included it without question, and Izuku ate a nutritionally optimized lunch without knowing the origin of the optimization. He found out 3 weeks later, when he was helping reorganize the classroom bookshelf and found the full document wedged between 2 hero regulation texts. It was labeled, in that same small precise script, Midoriya Izuku, physical support reference, and it was 47 pages long. He stood with it in his hands for a long time. Then he very carefully put it back where he had found it and did not mention it to anyone, because he was not entirely sure what to do with the information that someone had spent what appeared to be considerable time thinking about how to make sure he was adequately fed, and the feeling that produced in him was not something he currently had the vocabulary for. Setsuna Tokage was the one who officially introduced herself first, striding up to his desk on day 1 with the forward momentum of someone who had decided to make this happen and saw no reason to delay. Her quirk allowed her to detach parts of her body and control them independently, which she demonstrated by waving at him with a hand that had separated from her wrist and floated, cheerfully, at eye level. She observed his startled expression with open delight. "I do that to everyone," she said. "You did better than Aways." He screamed. "Don't tell him I told you that." "I won't," he said. "I'm Setsuna Tokage. I know who you are, obviously. Everyone knows who you are. What I want to know that I don't already know is what you're actually like, because reputation and person are usually different things." She retrieved her hand with the casual ease of someone putting on a glove. "So, what are you actually like?" Izuku considered this with the sincerity he applied to all direct questions. "Probably a lot more ordinary than the reputation," he said. "I cry when I'm very happy or very scared. I have more notebooks than I have shelf space for, and I am genuinely not sure I've ever had a cool moment that wasn't immediately followed by something embarrassing." Tokage stared at him. Then she laughed, the real unguarded kind, and pointed at him with her attached index finger. "Okay. I like you. You're staying. I don't think I have much choice. I was transferred. Everyone who is here because they're supposed to be here," she said with serene confidence. "The universe has opinions. I've learned to trust them." She returned to her seat, still smiling, and Izuku had the distinct impression that something had been decided that he had not been fully consulted about. He wrote it in his notebook under Tokage, Setsuna, high social confidence, direct communication style, philosophical inclination disguised as casualness. And then, after a pause, he added, "I think she is going to be one of the more interesting people I have ever met." He was not wrong about this. Chapter 3, Practical Applications. The first joint training session between Class 1B and whatever remained of Class 1A's practical cohort was scheduled for the 3rd week of October, which gave Izuku 2 weeks to understand the shape of his new class in the context of actual hero work. 2 weeks was, as it turned out, exactly the right amount of time to understand that Class 1B operated as a unit in ways that Class 1A, for all its individual brilliance, had never quite managed. Where Class 1A's strength had always been in the exceptional peaks of its individual members, Class 1B had developed something that Izuku's notebooks described as distributed excellence, the capacity of the whole to perform consistently above its individual baseline through genuine mutual reinforcement. He watched this happen on a Tuesday afternoon during a rescue simulation on the East Training Field, standing at the observer post with Vlad King while the class moved through a collapsed building scenario that the support department had constructed with impressive attention to structural authenticity. Ibara Shiozaki, who could extend and control vines from her hair with a precision that suggested deep communion with her own quirk, moved through the outer debris field with the kind of methodical grace that came from rehearsed efficiency. But she was not working alone. Nairenjiki Shota, whose twin impact quirk allowed him to double the force of any impact, was working the heavy structural elements 30 feet away, and they were timing their movements to each other without visible communication, operating from an understanding of each other's rhythms that Izuku recognized as something that took months of shared training to build. Yui Kodai, silent and focused, was resizing debris to create paths, and Pony Tsunotori was using her horn cannons to clear material from an angle that Izuku calculated, after a moment of instinctive tactical analysis, would have taken most teams a full minute to identify as optimal. She had found it in under 30 seconds. They'd been training together for over a year, Vlad King said from beside him, without looking up from his evaluation clipboard. It was not quite an explanation, but it was the background that made the picture make sense. Their coordination index is significantly above average, Izuku said, because it was true and he was constitutionally unable to watch good hero work without commenting on it. Above average is generous, Vlad King said. They're fourth in national simulation rankings for their division. They were sixth until Shota and Kodai worked out the force scaling timing protocol. He paused. Which they did on their own. I just found out about it when I saw the ranking change. Izuku looked at the field with new eyes. The ranking change. The timing protocol. A team that quietly solved its own problems and improved its own performance without waiting for instruction. He wrote 4 lines in his notebook, then crossed them out, and wrote a single line instead. This is what it looks like when a class decides to be great at the same time. Afterward, when the simulation was complete and the class was running through the debrief, Itsuka Kendo appeared beside him with the naturalness of someone moving towards something they had already decided to move toward. You were calculating, she said. Not accusatory. Observational. I analyze, he said. It's a habit. I'm sorry if it seemed like I wasn't engaged. It didn't seem like that at all. I watched you watching. I was curious what you saw. She tilted her head. So what did you see? Izuku considered withholding the full answer, then dismissed the consideration, because Kendo was the kind of person who would immediately know if he was giving her a partial truth and would find it more impolite than the full version. I saw a team that has learned to multiply each other, he said. Not just support each other. Multiply. Shota and Shiozaki aren't just working alongside each other, they're making each other more than the sum of the parts. Kodai and Tsunotori are doing the same thing from a different angle. The coordination isn't just tactical. It's emotional. You trust each other in the specific way that makes the math of hero work go up instead of sideways. Kendo was quiet for a moment. That's a very precise observation. I've been watching hero work for a long time, he said. I know what the good version of it looks like. What does Class 1A look like? She asked it carefully, without weaponry. Brilliant, he said honestly. And fierce. And sometimes the brilliance and the fierceness spend so much energy on each other that the multiplication gets complicated. He paused. I say that with enormous affection for all of them. Kendo smiled. It was a real smile, not the professionally warm one she used when managing the room. This one was smaller and more direct. I think, she said, that you're going to fit in here in ways you haven't anticipated yet. He was going to ask what she meant by that, but the debrief was starting and Vlad King was calling for attention, and the moment passed into the general motion of the afternoon. He thought about it later, lying on his bed in the Class 1B dorm with his notebooks open on his chest and the low sounds of the building settling around him. The sentence had the quality of something that knew more than it was saying, which was a quality he associated with people who paid more attention than they let on. Kendo paid attention. He had established that much in 2 weeks. What he had not established, and would spend considerably longer figuring out, was the precise direction in which that attention was oriented. Or the fact that he was not the only one in Class 1B who had developed a particular and specific direction for their attention. This was, in retrospect, the kind of thing that a person with his level of observational skill should probably have picked up on faster. But he had always been considerably better at analyzing hero work than at analyzing the things that were happening directly to him. It was, as Ochako had once told him with exasperated affection, a very specific kind of genius combined with a very specific kind of blindness, and the combination was something she found both endearing and occasionally very frustrating. He missed Ochako, with the clean simple ache of someone missing a friend. He texted her. She replied in 30 seconds with 3 emoji that he was still learning to interpret accurately and a voice message that made him laugh. He fell asleep with his phone on his chest and his notebooks on his stomach, and in the morning he went back to Class 1B, and the learning continued. Chapter 4, The Study Group Question. The study group formed in the 4th week, which Izuku would later mark as the moment when what had been a collection of individual kindnesses began to organize itself into something with identifiable shape and direction. It started, as most things in Class 1B appeared to start, with Itsuka Kendo identifying a problem and proposing a practical solution with minimum drama. The problem was the quarterly assessment cycle, which Vlad King ran with the specific seriousness of a man who believed that how a hero student performed under academic pressure was genuine predictive data for how they would perform under field pressure. The assessment covered 6 subject areas including hero law and ethics, quirk theory and application, tactical analysis, physical science fundamentals, Japanese literature, and modern languages. The study group met in the common room on the first Thursday evening, and Izuku arrived to find 7 people already there with textbooks open and the specific focused energy of people who had already organized the space and were now waiting for the session to actually begin. Kendo was at the head of the long table, which was natural. Tokage was beside her with 3 separate notebooks open to 3 separate pages, which was characteristic. Yanagi sat at the far end with a pencil and the kind of stillness that made the air around her feel quieter. Kinoko Komori, who had a mushroom quirk that she used with a peculiarly cheerful inventiveness, sat with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, looking at the subject list with the bright concentration of someone who genuinely enjoyed the process of learning and was not bothered by the performance anxiety of being assessed on it. Yui Kodai sat beside her with characteristic silence, a stack of color-coded index cards already sorted in her hands. Pony Tsunotori had a foreign language dictionary open in front of her and was looking at the Japanese literature section of the assessment guide with the expression of someone encountering a mountain they had agreed to climb before fully appreciating its altitude. And Ibara Shiozaki sat with her textbook open to the hero ethics section, reading with the focused serenity of someone who found the material genuinely aligned with her own thinking and was simply enjoying the encounter. Midoriya, Kendo said, looking up. Good. Sit anywhere. We're working through subject allocation first. Subject allocation, he said, settling into the nearest empty chair. Everyone has areas of strength. We're mapping those against areas of need and creating targeted support pairs. It saves time and tends to produce better results than everyone studying everything alone. She said this with the efficiency of someone who had already tested the method and was reporting its outcomes. Izuku opened his notebook. That's a very methodical approach. Kendo is a very methodical person, Tokage said from behind her 3 notebooks. She has a spreadsheet. She always has a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is already 4 days old. The spreadsheet is 2 days old and it has been updated twice, Kendo said, with the patience of someone managing light teasing from a direction they were accustomed to. Izuku looked at the group around the table and felt the specific warmth of being included in something that had its own established patterns, its own language, its own texture, and was making room for him inside that without requiring him to perform anything other than showing up and being useful. He was useful. This turned out to be a significant and somewhat complicated thing. He was useful in quirk theory and application, where his 15-plus notebooks of detailed hero analysis gave him a depth of practical knowledge that complemented the more framework-oriented approach the textbooks took. He was useful in tactical analysis, where the way his mind processed combat situations turned out to be genuinely clarifying to the others in the way that a particular kind of explanation sometimes is, not because the person explaining is the only one who understands but because they have found a way of describing it that makes the understanding snap into place. He was useful in physical science because All Might had been a rigorous teacher about the mechanics of force, velocity, and impact, and Izuku had internalized those mechanics at a cellular level. He was less useful, he discovered, in modern languages. His English was functional but not elegant. Pony noticed immediately. Your verb conjugation is technically correct, she said in careful Japanese, because she was the kind of person who navigated language barriers with genuine patience. But your accent is doing something interesting. Interesting is a diplomatic word, he said. She laughed, a bright uncomplicated sound. I meant it. My Japanese is doing interesting things too. We are both interesting at each other. She extended a hand. Language partners? Absolutely, he said. And meant it. Komori taught him 2 mushroom genus names in Latin that evening because she had decided, for reasons that were never entirely explained, that knowing biological nomenclature was useful general knowledge, and she delivered the lesson with such warm enthusiasm that he wrote them down and retained them and has never, to this day, forgotten them. Shiozaki, who he had expected to be quiet, turned out to have considerable depth on the hero ethics material and a way of articulating the harder questions of moral responsibility that he found genuinely interesting rather than didactic. Yanagi did not speak much during the session, but every time she did speak it was to say exactly the thing that reorganized the preceding 10 minutes of conversation into sudden clarity. He walked back to his room at 10:30 with his notebook full and his brain running at the specific elevated temperature that meant he had genuinely engaged with something that mattered. He sat at his desk and wrote, not notes, but something more like an observation. There is a way that Class 1B thinks together, he wrote. It is not the same as Class 1A's way, which was more like collision, productive and energizing but always with the friction of individual momentum encountering other individual momentum. This is more like water finding a level. Everyone moves toward the place where the group functions best, and they do it without apparent effort, which means the effort happened earlier, in the building of the kind of trust that makes the movement possible. He paused. I find myself wanting to be part of this in a way that feels different from wanting to be useful. I am not entirely sure how to categorize that. He closed the notebook. He picked up his phone. He thought about texting Achiko, then put the phone down, because he was not sure he had the words yet for what he was trying to say, and he had learned that trying to say things before he had the words for them produced more confusion than it resolved. He went to sleep and dreamed, in the way his brain processed things it had not finished filing, about a classroom full of people who had made room for him in something they had built carefully, and the particular quality of being welcomed into architecture you had not helped design. Chapter 5, Kendo's Question. The conversation happened on a Friday afternoon in October, during a free period that landed after their practical training session and before the dinner service, in the specific pocket of time that the UA schedule created with what Izuku sometimes suspected was intentional design, enough space for things to happen that needed space to happen. He was in the third-floor training room, running the same sequence of Delaware Smash repetitions that All Might had assigned as muscle memory work 3 months ago and that he continued to run because his body now understood them as a baseline check, a way of knowing that everything was calibrated correctly. He was not aware that Kendo was in the room until she spoke, which surprised him, because he was generally aware of who was in a room. Your left shoulder is compensating, she said from the doorway. She was still in her training gear, arms crossed, watching him with the frank observational quality that he had come to understand as simply how she looked at things she was genuinely paying attention to. He stopped. He rotated his left shoulder experimentally. She was correct. How long have you been watching? Since before you started the sequence. I came in to use the floor mats, you were already there, you looked focused and I didn't want to interrupt. She walked in and set her water bottle on the bench. Your left shoulder has been compensating since Wednesday. Did you take a hit during the simulation? I miscalculated an exit vector and caught the corner of a structural element, he said. It's not serious. Have you told Recovery Girl? It's not serious enough to warrant, I think. Kendo gave him a look of patient, entirely unconvinced attention. Midoriya. Part of my understanding of you at this point is that your definition of not serious enough to warrant tends to run about 40% below the actual threshold. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He said, that is probably accurate. I'll walk you to the infirmary. You really don't have to. I know I don't have to. She picked up her water bottle. I want to. Come on. They walked through the building in the particular quiet of a late Friday afternoon when most of the students were in the common areas or outside, and the hallways had that temporary expansiveness that institutions get when the people who usually fill them are elsewhere. Kendo walked beside him with an unhurried stride, and after a while she said, Can I ask you something? Of course. How are you doing? Not physically. Generally. She said it without looking at him, which he recognized as the conversational posture of someone asking something they suspected might be harder to answer than it sounded, and who was giving him the option of not having eye contact while he figured it out. Izuku thought about the question with the genuine engagement it deserved, because it was not a question that often got asked in exactly that form, and he had been told by his therapist, whom he saw every other Tuesday, that he had a tendency to paper over the genuine answer to that question with the logistical answer, the version that talked about training benchmarks and academic performance and missed the actual question entirely. I think I'm doing better than I expected, he said. I missed Class 1A more than I thought I would, in the first week. It felt like leaving a place that was shaped like me. And I was worried about whether I would. I don't know. Whether I would slot in properly here, or whether there would be this permanent quality of being the transfer student, the outsider who doesn't quite fit the shared history. And now? Now I feel like I'm learning to fit. In a way that's different from how I fit in Class 1A. He paused. Class 1A, I grew into it. I was there from the beginning and the fit was made by the same process that made the class. This is different. The class already has its shape, and I'm finding where I belong inside something already formed. Which is harder in some ways and in other ways, I think, might be producing something I didn't expect. What kind of something? He considered that question for the length of the corridor they were walking through. I don't have the word for it yet, he said honestly. Kendo nodded, as if this was a satisfactory answer. I think the word exists, she said. You'll find it. Recovery Girl examined his shoulder with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades and had strong opinions about students who waited too long to seek treatment. She administered her quirk with a click of her tongue and told him to eat something high in protein before bed and to come back immediately if it recurred and to please, for once, not wait until the quiet ache became a structural problem. He thanked her. He and Kendo walked back through the quiet hallways. Can I ask you something now? He said. Yes. Why did you come find me in the training room? You said you came to use the floor mats, but you didn't actually use them. Kendo was quiet for 3 steps. I noticed your shoulder on Wednesday, she said. And I thought about whether to mention it then, and I decided to wait and see if you addressed it yourself. You didn't. So I went to find you. Another step. I tend to keep track of the people in my class. It's part of being class president. But I think, with you, it might also be something else. Something else, he repeated. Something else, she agreed. She stopped at the stairwell. Good night, Midoriya. Eat the protein. She went up the stairs. He watched the stairwell door close after her, and then he stood in the hallway for a moment, turning her last words over in the particular way he turned things over when they were interesting and he did not yet know what to do with the interest. He ate the protein. He wrote in his notebook the line about something else, and he underlined it twice, not because he understood it yet, but because he had the feeling it was the kind of thing he was going to need to have underlined when he figured it out later. He was right about this. Chapter 6, What Tokage Knows. Setsuna Tokage had a gift for knowing things before she was supposed to know them, and the gift was not a quirk and not a superpower, it was simply the product of paying extremely close attention and having absolutely no inclination to pretend she had not noticed what she had noticed. She noticed things in the way that certain people do who have lived their entire lives slightly outside the main current of social convention and have therefore developed the observer's advantage of watching from the edges. She had always been this way. She was the girl who had been categorized as weird and had accepted the categorization without argument and found that the space outside the main current was actually extremely comfortable and afforded excellent visibility. She knew, for instance, that Kendo had spent 20 minutes on Tuesday looking at Midoriya's notes from the previous week's tactical analysis session and that she had not been studying the tactical analysis. She knew that Yanagi had added a second reference document to the bento nutrition folder and that the second document included information about post-training hydration that no one had asked for but that was going to be genuinely useful. She knew that Pony and Midoriya had been meeting twice a week for language exchange sessions that had started at 45 minutes and had extended, gradually and without either of them explicitly deciding to extend them, to 2 hours. She knew these things because she paid attention. And she kept them in the same place she kept everything she noticed, in a private and well-organized mental filing system that she used for the specific purpose of understanding the people around her well enough to be genuinely useful to them when it mattered. She did not use this information for gossip. She did not have the gossip instinct. What she had instead was something more like a cartographer's interest in the shape of relationships, the way they connected and influenced each other, the topology of a social environment. She found it professionally interesting and personally warming to watch people move toward the things that were good for them. What was happening with Midoriya was, from this vantage point, some of the most interesting material she had ever had to watch. She found him in the common room library on a Sunday afternoon, surrounded by notebooks and the specific aura of someone who had been in the same spot for 3 hours and was not planning to move. She sat across from him without asking, because she had found that asking gave people the opportunity to be politely discouraging, and she did not want to be politely discouraged. "What are you working on?" she said. He looked up with the mild surprise of someone returning from a great distance. "Quirk interaction analysis. For the team exercise next week." "You're analyzing us," she said. It was not an accusation. If anything, it was an invitation. "I analyze everything," he said. "It's reflexive." "I apologize if it seems invasive." "It doesn't seem invasive. I'm the same way." Different method, same instinct. She leaned forward and looked at his notebook from the opposite direction, not trying to read it, just acknowledging that it existed. "What do you have so far?" He hesitated. Then, with the particular quality of someone deciding to be more honest than their default setting, he turned the notebook so she could see it. The page was full of diagrams. Movement maps, quirk interaction vectors, timing sequences, and woven through all of it, with a different pen and a slightly different handwriting that she thought might be the kind of thing people do when they are writing for themselves rather than for an audience, brief notational observations about the people themselves. Small things. She is always slightly to the left of where anyone expects her to be. She uses the support role without ever performing it. The hesitation before she commits to a decision is not uncertainty, it is precision. "This is us," Tokage said. Not a question. "Yes." He looked at the page. "I know it might be strange. That I've been watching closely enough to notice, I don't know, personal patterns. It's how my brain works. I'm not. I would never use it for anything that wasn't trying to help." "I know," she said. "You know? I told you. I'm the same way. I've been mapping you since day one." She said it without apology, because she had long ago decided that apology for the way her mind worked was not something she owed anyone. "You are," she said, "considerably more interesting than the reputation suggested." "The reputation is impressive. The person is better." He looked at her with the expression he got when he was processing something that had come from a direction he had not anticipated. "Tokage," he said. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Always." "I prefer direct." "What is happening?" He said it carefully, feeling for the shape of what he meant. "In class. Around me. I keep having the sense that there is a pattern that I should be able to read, and I can read patterns, and I can't read this one. I don't know if I'm misreading it or if I'm not reading it because I don't want to, and my brain is protecting me from a conclusion that seems like it might be, that I might be, reaching, or..." He stopped. He had run out of sentence. Tokage looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You're not reaching." The common room was quiet around them. Outside the window, the afternoon was going golden in the way October afternoons do when the light gets low and particular. "Oh," he said. "Yeah," she said. "A beat. I need to think about this," he said. "Of course you do," she said. "Take whatever time you need. Nobody is in a hurry." She stood up and stretched with the easy physicality of someone comfortable in their body. "The important thing is that you know. Now you know. The rest is just figuring out what you want to do with it." She picked up her bag. "For what it's worth, from a purely observational standpoint, I think you are exactly the kind of person this works well for. You are, genuinely, the kind of person a lot of people can care about at the same time without it being complicated. You make it simple by being who you are." She shrugged, the easy shrug of someone who has stated a fact and finds no reason to editorialize further. Sunday evening. "You should eat." "I should eat," he agreed, automatically. "Kendo left something in the common room kitchen with your name on it," she said over her shoulder, already moving toward the door. "She was by an hour ago. She thought you looked like you'd been in here too long." He looked at his notebook. He looked at the door through which Tokage had exited. He looked at the afternoon light. He picked up his notebook and went to the kitchen, and there was a container labeled in careful writing with his name and the specific notation of what it contained and the time it had been left, because Kendo was Kendo, and she organized her care the same way she organized everything else. He ate. He thought. He wrote nothing in his notebook that evening, because some things needed to process in silence before they were ready to be words. Chapter 7, The Shape of Something New. He called his mother on Sunday night, because she was the person he called when he needed to think out loud to someone who would listen without agenda, and she was very good at that. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake and not busy and possibly, in the way she sometimes was, already expecting his call in the way that mothers sometimes seem to anticipate the moments when their children needed them. "Izuku," she said, and already he could hear the warm attending quality of her voice, the specific focus of her full attention. "Hi, Mom." He was lying on his bed with the ceiling as his focal point, the standard position for calls that required full cognitive availability. "I want to tell you something and I'm not sure I have the right words for it yet, but I want to try." "Take your time," she said. He took a breath. "Something is happening with Class 1B, he said. "Not something wrong." "Something, I think, right. But it's large. And I wanted to." He paused. "I wanted to tell someone who knows me well enough to tell me if I'm being ridiculous." She made the sound she made when she was listening very carefully and not planning to interrupt. He told her. He told her about Kendo's bentos and Yanagi's 47 pages and Tokage's directness and Pony's language sessions and Komori's mushroom nomenclature and Shiozaki's ethics discussions and Kodai's index cards and the rest of the class and the ways he had begun to understand them, the ways each of them had, without explicit coordination, been building something in his direction over the course of 5 weeks. He told her what Tokage had said that afternoon. His mother was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "How do you feel?" "Overwhelmed," he said. "But not in a bad way. In the way that I feel when something is larger than I was expecting and I need to adjust my understanding to accommodate it." "That's a very Izuku way to describe it," she said, and there was warmth in it. "What should I do?" he said. He knew it was a simplification. He knew what he actually meant was more complex than that. But sometimes the simplification was what you needed to start. "What do you want to do?" she said, which was the question he should have expected because she had always, from the time he was very small, been committed to the idea that what he wanted was something worth knowing and worth acting on. He stared at the ceiling. The ceiling had no answers, but it was a comfortable surface to think at. "I think," he said slowly, "that I want to be honest. With myself first. And then with them." He paused. "I came here and I was so focused on fitting in. On being useful. On not disrupting what they had built. That I wasn't fully paying attention to what was building toward me." Another pause. "I think I need to pay attention now." "That sounds like the right thing," his mother said. "It sounds terrifying," he said. "Those are frequently the same thing," she said. "Izuku. You walked into situations with villains with enough power to level buildings and you did not stop walking. You are not going to be undone by your feelings for people who care about you." He was quiet for a moment. "When you say it that way, it does seem a little less frightening." "Just a little," she agreed. He laughed. It was the real laugh, not the social one. They talked for another 45 minutes about things that were not the main subject and were therefore exactly the right things to talk about after the main subject had been addressed: his training, her work, the neighborhood cat that had appeared in their garden and shown no inclination to leave, his analysis of a recent hero mission he had watched coverage of, her opinion of the coverage. He went to sleep at 11 with his phone on the charger and the sense of having arrived somewhere that he had been walking toward without knowing it, the specific orientation of someone who has recognized the territory and now needs to decide how to move through it. Monday morning he arrived in the classroom and he sat in his seat and he opened his notebook and he began, carefully and deliberately, to pay attention in the way Tokage had suggested, not the analysis he applied to everything, the automatic professional observation, but the more personal kind. He paid attention to how it felt when Kendo greeted him at the door with the morning update on the training schedule and he knew she had put together that update specifically so he would have it. He paid attention to how it felt when Yanagi, passing his desk on the way to the window, placed a small piece of paper on the corner without comment that turned out to be a note about the corrected timing on a studying method he had mentioned the previous week. He paid attention to how it felt when Tokage caught his eye across the room and raised an eyebrow, and he realized she was asking, without words, if he had processed what she had said, and he gave her the smallest nod he had, and she smiled with the warm satisfaction of someone watching something that has been waiting to happen finally begin. He paid attention to Pony's wave from across the room, Komori's bright greeting, Shiozaki's quiet nod, Kodai's small acknowledgement that was significant in proportion to how rarely she offered it. He paid attention to the accumulated weight of 17 separate forms of attention oriented in his direction, each distinct, each genuine, each built over 5 weeks of proximity and shared work, and the specific chemistry that forms between people who have been honest with each other in the middle of hard things. It was, he thought, writing nothing down because this was not the kind of thing for notebooks, the largest thing that had ever happened to him that did not involve a villain or a crisis or the activation of a power. It was, he thought, the beginning of something he did not yet have the vocabulary for. But he was going to learn the vocabulary. He was good at learning things. He was, it turned out, about to get better at it. Act 2, What Gets Built in November. Chapter 8, What Gets Built in November. November arrived at UA the way it always did, with a specific quality of cold that was different from October cold in the way that serious things are different from their previews. The training fields took on that gray particular light that makes everything look like it is being filmed for documentation rather than lived in, and the students moved through their schedules with the heightened focus of people who understood that the second-term assessments were not a future problem anymore but a present one, close enough to feel. Izuku had been in Class 1B for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks he had filled 2 notebooks with observations, learned 14 new things about quirk compatibility he had not previously theorized, improved his English conjugation under Pony's patient instruction to a level she described as approaching charming, and developed what he understood, now, to be a genuine and specific feeling for each of the 17 girls in his class that he was still in the slow process of learning how to hold. The feeling was not the same for each of them. This was the first thing he had established in the careful internal accounting he had been doing since Tokage's Sunday afternoon declaration. It would have been simpler if it were the same, if what he felt were a uniform warmth, a general affection for the class as a collective, the way you might feel about a team that had welcomed you. That would have been categorizable. That would have fit in a notebook. What he actually felt was 17 distinct things, each shaped by the specific person who had produced it, and the aggregate of those 17 things was something that did not have a clean label but that he had begun, privately and without announcing it to anyone, to understand as the center of gravity that the second half of his first year at UA was going to organize itself around. He was not, on balance, frightened by this. He had expected to be more frightened. But Tokage had been right in the thing she had said about him being the kind of person this worked for, not because he was exceptional in any way that made the arithmetic of caring easy, but because the particular things that made him who he was, the genuine attention, the absence of performance, the way he treated every person's concerns as if they were the most important thing currently happening, produced an environment in which multiple people could exist in relation to him without the dynamic becoming competitive or diminishing. They were not competing. This was the second thing he had established. Whatever was forming in Class 1B around him was not organized like a competition because nobody in Class 1B had a competitive relationship with each other about it. They had, through some combination of the class's existing culture of mutual support and the particular quality of the people involved, arrived at something more like a shared understanding, unspoken and unformalized but present in the room the way temperature is present, felt rather than seen. He had not fully understood this until the Tuesday afternoon when Kendo and Tokage were both in the common room kitchen at the same time as him, and the three of them had made dinner together in the easy collaborative way of people who have worked out their respective roles in a shared space, and there had been not one moment of anything that could be called tension between the two of them, and he had watched this and understood that the absence of tension was not accidental. It was, he thought, the most unusual thing he had ever been in the middle of. And the most surprisingly comfortable. On the first Monday of November, Vlad King announced a new training structure. For the remainder of the term, each student would be paired with a rotation partner for combat training, with partnerships changing every 2 weeks to ensure exposure to a maximum range of quirk interaction styles. The announcement was accompanied by a posted schedule that Izuku looked at for approximately 30 seconds before arriving at the conclusion that whoever had designed the rotation had done so with a particular intentionality, because his first partner was Itsuka Kendo. He looked at the schedule. He looked at Kendo, who was looking at the schedule from across the room. She caught his eye. She did not look surprised. He had, by now, learned that Kendo was very rarely surprised by things, because she paid the kind of attention that reduced surprise to a minimum. She smiled, the small direct one. He wrote, in the margin of his notebook, where the week's training schedule was supposed to go, "November is going to be interesting." He was, as usual, substantially correct. Chapter 9, Kendo. Training with Kendo was a specific and instructive experience that Izuku found himself looking forward to in ways that he catalogued carefully and tried not to overthink. She fought with economy. This was the first thing, the professional observation that preceded and in some ways enabled all the other observations. Her quirk was powerful in the literal physical sense, the expansion of her hands to a scale that could redirect force, block incoming damage, and create pressure that other quirks had to work around or absorb. But she did not use it the way that people with physically large quirks often did, as a primary instrument, something to point at the problem. She used it as one element in a system of movement and positioning and timing that she had refined, visibly, through considerable and disciplined practice. She was also paying attention to him. He knew this because he was paying attention to her, and the two forms of attention recognized each other, the way that a particular kind of awareness can detect its reflection. Their first session was on a Wednesday in the South Training Yard, with Vlad King on the observation platform running notes and two other pairs working in adjacent sections of the field. The ground was cold enough that their breath misted in the early morning air. Izuku had done his pre-session calibration. Kendo had stretched with the focused routine of someone who had learned exactly what her body needed before it needed to perform. They squared up at the center marker. "No holding back on the OFA," she said. "Not completely. I need to see what I'm actually dealing with. I'll hold back enough not to put you through a wall," he said. "That seems like a reasonable floor." "Appreciated," she said. And then she moved. She was fast. He had known this from observation. Knowing it and experiencing it as the person being closed on were different things. She came at a 45-degree angle from his centerline, which was tactically correct for someone whose primary defensive advantage was her hands, because it put her natural guard between his most common attack vector and her body. Her hands expanded as she closed, not to full size, to a controlled intermediate scale that gave her reach without sacrificing the speed of her movement. He went sideways and low, the kind of movement that his body had learned in the months since full cowl became a baseline rather than an effort, the kind that looked impossible until you understood what one for all actually did to the physics of a body moving through space. She tracked the redirect and adjusted. He went again. She adjusted again. They did this for 40 minutes. Afterward, they sat at the edge of the field with water bottles and the specific comfortable quiet of people who have just been very honest with each other through a medium that did not require words. The cold was insistent. The mist of their breath had evened out. "You pull your left combinations," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm aware of the habit. I'm working on it. It's not bad. It's a tell, but it's the kind of tell that's hard to exploit unless you know what you're looking at. Most opponents won't see it fast enough to use it. But some will." "Some will," she agreed. "I did. I noticed," he said, with the honesty of someone who had appreciated being read clearly and did not mind acknowledging it. She turned her water bottle in her hands. "You're better than your reputation in close quarters," she said. "The reputation is mostly about the raw force application. People don't talk as much about how you move when you're not applying force. You move like someone who has made a very thorough study of being difficult to pin." "I spent a long time being someone who couldn't afford to take hits," he said. "You develop alternatives." "Yes," she said. "I can see that." A pause. "It shows. In the way you move when you think you might be about to make a mistake. You don't freeze. You redirect. That's not a physical skill. That's a character quality that became a physical skill." He looked at her. She was still looking at her water bottle, but there was a quality to the observation she had just made that had not been purely tactical. Kendo, he said. Midoriya, she said. Are we talking about combat? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, mostly. He nodded. Okay, she said, with the quality of someone checking that the word meant what it appeared to mean. Okay, he confirmed. He did not know exactly what he was confirming. He knew it was something. He knew she knew it was something. The something existed between them clearly enough that naming it felt like unnecessary work on an object that was already visible. She stood up. Brushed frost-damp grass from the back of her training shorts. Same time Friday? Same time Friday, he said. She walked toward the training facility entrance with the same economic stride she used for everything, and he watched her go with the specific attention of someone who is learning a new kind of fluency and is aware of the learning happening in real time. He wrote in his notebook afterward, combat observation, Kendo, redirects instead of freezing. Also, the same is true of her in general. She does not freeze when something becomes complicated. She finds the new angle. I find this extremely, and he paused here, and then he wrote, relevant. He underlined it once. He did not underline it twice. Once felt like the right weight. Chapter 10, What Yanagi Does Not Say. Reiko Yanagi's partnership rotation came in the second week of November, and it produced something that Izuku had not anticipated, which was the discovery that Reiko Yanagi, in a one-on-one training context with sufficient time and the absence of a group to manage her communication through, was one of the most interesting people he had ever been in a room with. She did not appear to be this way from the outside, which he understood was precisely the point. She had the external quality of someone whose interior life was so rich and organized that she had no particular need to externalize it for general consumption. She spoke in class when she had something to contribute. She was never silent in the way of someone who had nothing to say. She was silent in the way of someone who was doing a great deal of something that did not require speech. Her quirk, which she called poltergeist, was psychokinetic in nature. She could move objects without touching them, with a precision and control that he found professionally remarkable and an effective range that he spent their first session attempting to map, because the mapping kept changing, which he eventually realized meant that her effective range was not a fixed property but a variable one, dependent on her focus and on something she did with her breathing that he could not fully identify but that visibly shifted the quality of the air around her when she was working at maximum precision. She never looked at the thing she was moving. This was the detail that caught him the most, the way she would be looking directly at him while the training targets deployed on their posts and rotated and changed height around her without any visible direction from her face. The control came from somewhere internal and complete, and her eyes were entirely free to be doing something else, which in their training sessions meant they were usually watching him. He found this unnerving in the specific pleasant way that things that are both strange and harmless can be unnerving, the way a very clever piece of engineering can produce a small aesthetic discomfort alongside the appreciation. On the third day of their rotation, she said, during a water break in the middle of a coordination exercise, "You are wondering about the document." He had been thinking about something else entirely. He recalibrated. "The 47 pages, he said. "Yes. I found it by accident," he said. "I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how to address it without making it strange." "It is strange," she said, with the straightforwardness of someone who had come to terms with a fact and did not need to manage it. "I researched your dietary requirements to an extent that was not asked of me and that I did not announce. I was aware at the time that this was not a typical behavior. I continued anyway." "Why?" he said. He said it gently, because the question was genuine and not intended as a challenge. She considered it with the same quality of attention she gave everything. "You arrived," she said. "And it was immediately apparent to me that the information environment around your physical needs was insufficient. You were not eating enough for your quirk load. I found this concerning. I am not typically a person who finds things concerning. When I notice that I find something concerning, I address the concern in the most practical way available to me." 47 pages, he said. "I was thorough," she said, without inflection, which he had learned was the absence of inflection that meant she understood perfectly well that this was a lot and had chosen to proceed anyway. He looked at her across the space of the training field, with the gray November sky above them and the distant sounds of the other pairs working on the adjacent fields. She looked back at him without looking away, which was characteristic of her. She had a way of maintaining eye contact that was not aggressive and not challenging but simply present, the way that very competent people sometimes hold a gaze not to dominate but simply because they have decided to look at something and see no reason to stop. "Yanagi," he said. "Thank you. Genuinely. For the document and for the notes and for the fact that you noticed when nobody else had." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very carefully, "You are difficult not to notice." He absorbed this. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It is a neutral observation that has become, over the course of the past several weeks, a positive one, she said. I did not initially plan for it to become positive. It simply did. I thought you should know. I appreciate you telling me, he said, because he did, and because she had said it with the particular vulnerability of someone who does not often externalize and had chosen to do so specifically for him, and that deserved acknowledgement. She nodded, once. Shall we continue? Yes, he said. They continued. The targets moved without her looking at them. He moved without holding back quite as much as he had on the first day. She adjusted for the increased speed with a lag time of approximately 1/3 of a second, which was faster than he had anticipated, and he said so, and she said, I have been calibrating, as if this were the most ordinary thing to say. For me, he said. For our sessions, she said. A small pause. Yes. He wrote in his notebook that evening, Yanagi calibrates. She calibrates everything. She calibrated her research before I arrived and she is calibrating her quirk response to my movement patterns in real time. There is a quality to the way she does this that is not clinical. It looks clinical from the outside. From inside the receiving end of it, it feels, and he paused, searching for the word, like being considered very carefully by someone who considers very few things that carefully. He thought that might be the most accurate definition of her attention that he was capable of producing at this stage. He suspected he would revise it later. He usually revised things later, when the thing he was observing had given him more material to work with. Yanagi, he suspected, would give him considerably more material. Chapter 11, Pony in the Morning. The language exchange sessions with Pony Tsunotori had, by the second week of November, become the part of his weekly schedule that he thought about with the specific anticipation that he associated with things that were both productive and genuinely enjoyable, which was a combination rarer than it should have been. They met on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 7, in the small lounge at the end of the second-floor residential corridor, before the building filled with the morning motion of 100 students moving toward breakfast and class. The lounge had one large window that caught the early light and two comfortable chairs that had been there long enough to develop the specific personality of furniture that has been sat in many times by people in the middle of thinking about things. Pony arrived before him both times because she was constitutionally an early riser in the way that some people simply are, not disciplined, not effortful, simply oriented toward mornings by some internal clock that ran ahead of the general schedule. She had a way with language that he found fascinating from a cognitive standpoint. Her Japanese had developed through direct immersion over 14 months, which meant it had the shape of Japanese that has been learned from the inside out, vocabulary rich and idiom natural but occasionally surprising in its routing, taking paths through sentences that a native speaker would not take, not incorrectly, just differently. The way that someone navigating a city they know thoroughly by walking it knows different routes than someone who was born there. Her English, when she switched for his practice, was careful and encouraging in the way of someone who knows what it is to be a non-native speaker in an environment that expects native fluency and has never forgotten that. Your reading is very strong, she told him, on the second Tuesday. You read in English like someone who has read a lot of English. Hero documentation, he said. A lot of international case files. I read before I could speak much. That makes the gap, she said, nodding with the recognition of someone who had experienced a version of the same thing in reverse. The reading brain and the speaking brain are different. You learned one and not the other for a long time. That's exactly what it feels like, he said. I know what I want to say and then I open my mouth and the sound comes out wrong. The sound comes out like someone who has read a lot more than they have spoken, she said. This is not wrong. It is just where you are. You will catch up. The reading brain teaches the speaking brain eventually. She smiled with the warmth of someone delivering a promise they are confident in. I promise. She had a quality of warmth that was particular and consistent and not performed. He had noticed this early and continued to notice it because it was one of those qualities that reveals more of itself the closer you get to it, like a light source that appears small from a distance and becomes more significant the nearer you approach. She cared about people in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who had learned, possibly through the experience of being the person in the room who looked different and spoke differently and had to earn the room every time, that caring was both the easier thing and the braver thing, and she had chosen it without drama. He asked her once, during a Thursday session when the conversation had drifted from language practice into the more open territory that their sessions had increasingly found space for, what it had been like when she first arrived in Japan. She thought about it for a moment, looking at the window and the early light. Hard, she said. And then interesting. And then. Mine. She searched for the word, found it. Japan became mine not because it gave me anything special but because I worked to understand it and the understanding made it mine. She looked back at him. Do you understand that? I understand it, he said. I think I am doing the same thing with Class 1B right now. Working to understand it until it becomes mine. She looked at him for a moment, her head slightly to one side in the way she had when she was thinking about how to say something, the way she had when the thing she wanted to say was slightly more personal than the thing they had been talking about. You became Class 1B's before Class 1B became yours, she said. We decided that quickly. You are slower to decide. I'm not slow, he said. I'm thorough. She laughed, the bright clear laugh that she gave when something genuinely delighted her. Thorough, she repeated. Yes. Okay. Thorough. She shook her head with the warmth of someone who finds the specific quality of another person genuinely charming. Thorough Midoriya. This is your name now. I have a notebook, he said, feeling defensive in the pleasant way of someone who is being teased by someone they like. I write things down. I analyze. It is part of my process. I know it is your process, she said. I am not criticizing the process. I am observing it with affection. She said affection with the careful precision of someone who has chosen the word very deliberately. With affection, she repeated. He looked at her. She met his look with the characteristic directness that he had come to understand was not boldness for its own sake but simply the most natural mode of someone who had spent enough time navigating indirect communication that they had arrived at a deep preference for the other kind. Pony, he said. Midoriya, she said. I'm glad we do this, he said. It was not everything he might have said. But it was accurate and it was his and he meant it. She smiled. It was the smaller, more private version of the smile, the one he had started to be able to distinguish from the general warm one, the one that was specifically for things that mattered to her. I am also glad, she said. Outside the window the morning was getting lighter. Soon the rest of the building would wake up and the corridor would fill with sound and motion and the day would become what days were, full of things to do and people to navigate. But for the remaining 20 minutes of their session they stayed in the comfortable chairs with their language books open and the light coming in, and he practiced his speaking and she corrected him without making it feel like correction, and he thought that this particular thing, was one of the small structures of his current life that he was going to work very hard to maintain. Chapter 12, Komori in the Rain. It rained on the 15th of November. A serious November rain that arrived without the polite preview of earlier autumn showers and committed to its purpose with the earnestness of a season fully underway. The training fields were closed. The practical sessions were moved indoors to the secondary simulation rooms, which were functional but smaller, and the adjustment made everyone slightly compressed and therefore slightly more themselves. Kanoko Komori was extremely herself indoors in a rain, which is to say that she was even warmer and more enthusiastic than her default, because rain meant mushrooms, she explained to Izuku with complete earnestness when he arrived at the simulation room to find her already there and already in a state of what could only be described as joyful focus. Moisture activation, she said, gesturing at the high humidity air with both hands as if presenting evidence. My spores propagate better in this. I've been trying to get Vlad King to install a mist system in the main training areas for months, but there's apparently a budget consideration. She said budget consideration with the mild philosophical acceptance of someone who has learned to make peace with institutional constraints while retaining the right to find them mildly absurd. He had been partnered with her for the combat rotation's third week, which felt, to the part of his brain that was always running the background analysis, like a deliberate choice by whoever had designed the schedule. Not because Komori was a lesser challenge, she was not. Her quirk had capabilities that were genuinely difficult to work around and that he had studied in his preliminary analysis with the focused interest of someone encountering a quirk type he had not had significant one-on-one experience with. But because of the specific social quality that the pairing produced, which was that Komori's native mode of interaction was so warm and so earnestly present that it made the training space feel different from the other partnerships, not less professional. Differently professional. Like the difference between a library where you are expected to be quiet and a library where conversation is welcome if it serves the work. She talked while she trained. She did not seem to be aware of this as unusual, which he suspected meant she had always done it and that the people she had trained with had simply adapted to it as a feature of the experience. The commentary was not distraction. It was real-time analysis offered conversationally. Your reaction time goes up 0.2 seconds when you're moving laterally right, she observed, releasing a cloud of spores toward the training targets and watching him redirect through them with the equipment mask he was wearing, because Komori's quirk in an enclosed space required protective gear and she had handed him the mask at the start with the cheerful practicality of someone managing a safety consideration while keeping the mood light. I noticed it in the simulation footage from last week. You do something different with your shoulders when you're going right than when you're going left. That's the same compensation Kendo identified, he said, making note of this internally. Left pull. Yes, she said. But Kendo told you about the left side pull. I'm telling you about the right side response to the left side pull. It's a secondary effect. Like a plant compensating for a lean on one side by sending more roots out on the other. She tilted her head. Did you know mushrooms do something similar? When the fruiting body is stressed on one side, it redistributes the mycelial network to counterbalance. I did not know that, he said. Biology is so much like hero work, she said. Or hero work is so much like biology. I can't decide which direction the analogy goes. She released another spore cloud, this one a different species, he could tell from the color shift, and he went through the standard dispersal movement while tracking her position. I like you, she announced, apparently as a continuation of the same line of thought. He emerged from the spore cloud and looked at her. That was a sudden shift. Not really, she said. I was thinking about how you listen to things I say as if they're genuinely interesting, and I was thinking about how that's not as common as it should be, and I wanted to say that I noticed it and that I like it. And you? She shrugged with the ease of someone for whom stating affection was as natural as stating the weather. Both things. He stopped moving. He looked at her in the specific way that he had been learning to deploy, the paying attention way, the genuine kind. I do find it genuinely interesting, he said. The mushroom biology. I've been taking notes on your quirk since day one. I had no idea how layered it was until I started actually paying attention. Most people think my quirk is cute, she said. There was no bitterness in it, just the mild observation of someone who had categorized a recurring experience. Or funny. They underestimate the tactical capacity because the aesthetic is very round. Soft. Mushroom-shaped. She gestured at herself. The mycelial network, he said. The way you can propagate across a space through distributed spore colonization. The way different species have different effects, the way you can layer them, it's one of the most tactically complex support and incapacitation systems I've encountered in the first-year cohort. You have an information problem, not a capability problem. She stared at him. What, he said. You're the first person who has ever put it in those words, she said. Information problem. She said it as if tasting a new flavor. That's exactly what it is. I have notebooks, he said, for the second time in a week using it as explanation. I know, she said. I want to read them. They're in very chaotic handwriting, he warned. I work with fungal growth patterns for a living, she said. Chaos is just organization that hasn't been mapped yet. She smiled, the wide genuine one. Show me sometime? He said yes, because she had asked with the straightforward warmth of someone who was interested in knowing him through the things that were most his, and that was a form of interest that he had no defenses against and no particular desire to develop any. The rain continued outside. The spores drifted through the simulation space in their various colored clouds. He moved through them and she talked and he listened, and it was, he thought, one of the more quietly significant afternoons he had had in recent memory, in the specific way that significance sometimes accrues in environments that look ordinary from the outside. Chapter 13, What Shiozaki Believes. Ibara Shiozaki was, of all the people in Class 1B, the one who had taken the longest to become legible to Izuku, and the reason for this, he eventually understood, was that he had been reading her through a framework that did not quite fit her and that had to be adjusted before the reading could become accurate. He had initially categorized her as quiet, which was true in the way that descriptions are often true without being sufficient. She was quiet. She was also devout in a way that was not performative and not aggressive and not particularly interested in converting anyone to her perspective. It was simply a fact about her inner landscape, the way the color of someone's eyes is a fact, present and consistent and not requiring acknowledgement to continue existing. She referenced scriptural concepts in conversation with the ease of someone who thought in those terms, not as ornamentation but as the genuine language of her interior life. He had expected, before knowing her well, that the devoutness and the hero work orientation might produce a person whose worldview was narrow at the edges, where the two frameworks encountered questions neither of them handled cleanly. He had been wrong. Her thinking was, in fact, extraordinarily wide at the edges, because she had spent considerable time with the hard questions rather than routing around them, and the hard questions had made her more rather than less curious about the world. Their combat rotation partnership in the fourth week of November produced some of the most interesting conversations he had had at UA since the early months with Class 1A, and the conversations were not separate from the training, they were woven through it, the way some kinds of understanding are only reachable while doing something else at the same time. She fought with a grace that was particular to her, the vines extending from her hair in controlled arcs that he had to study carefully before he could even begin to read their trajectories. The vines were not random. They were precise in the way of something that has been given careful thought, and the precision had an aesthetic quality, which he noticed and filed under the category of things that said something true about the person deploying them. You extend your range before you establish control, he told her, on the second day, after he had spent enough time inside the movement pattern to have a clear picture of it. It's subtle. But there's a half second between the full extension and the moment when the vine is actually doing what you want it to do. That's an exploitable window. She considered this without defensiveness, the way a person considers useful information delivered respectfully. I have been aware of the delay, she said. I attribute it to the biological reality of the extension process. The vine requires the moment to, if I may use the word, feel what it is encountering before it can be directed with full precision. The vine has sensory input, he said, immediately and genuinely interested. Of a rudimentary kind. I do not understand the mechanism fully. I simply know that it is present. She drew the vine back with a gesture that was almost a request rather than a command. It requires the connection before it will fully cooperate. He wrote half a notebook page on this in the evening. He had follow-up questions that he rationed across the subsequent training days because he did not want to make the sessions feel like an interview. On the third day she said, after a particularly productive exchange that had required both of them to push harder than they had been pushing, "Can I ask you something?" "Always," he said. "How do you maintain the will to continue?" She said it with the directness of someone asking a question they have been holding for the right moment. "After everything that has happened to you. The injury history. The number of times you have been in situations where the odds were not in your favor. How do you maintain the conviction that you are doing the right thing and that the doing of it is worth the cost?" He was quiet for a moment, because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer, and real answers about things like this took a moment to find accurately. "I don't know if I can separate the conviction from the person I am," he said. "I have been trying to be a hero since before I had a quirk." The trying was not about calculation, It was not about weighing the cost against the outcome. It was something more fundamental than that. Something about who I understood myself to be. A pause. I think the will comes from that place. From understanding what I am in relation to what I believe is right. When those two things are aligned, the cost is manageable. Not easy. Manageable. She was looking at him with the quality of attention she gave things that she found worth attending to fully. You believe that heroism is a vocation, she said. Not a profession. A calling. Yes, he said. I think that's the most accurate way to put it. I understand that, she said. And then, quieter, I find it resonant. In your case specifically, not as a general principle. Because the calling is visible in you. It is not separate from who you are. It is how you are. He did not know what to say to this. He had received a great deal of feedback on his hero abilities and his development and his performance. He could not recall previously having received feedback on his heroism as a quality of his being, as something that described not what he did but what he was. Thank you, he said. He said it carefully, because it needed to be said with weight. She nodded, and turned to retract her vines from the training equipment, and the session wound down in the comfortable quiet of two people who had reached a mutual understanding that did not require further language to confirm. He went back to his room and wrote for an hour, not about quirk analysis, but about the harder question of what it meant to be seen in that particular way, as someone whose intention was legible in their nature rather than only in their actions, and whether that was the kind of thing that, once seen, changed the terms of being in a room with someone who had seen it. He concluded that it did, and that this was not something to be cautious about, but something to be grateful for. Chapter 14, Kodai's Method. Yui Kodai communicated in precision. This was the most accurate summary he could produce after 4 weeks of observation and 1 week of direct partnership in the combat rotation, and it was a summary that kept revealing new dimensions the longer he looked at it. She was not taciturn in the way of someone who had nothing to say. She was concise in the way of someone who had identified the minimum necessary information load to convey a complete thought and saw no aesthetic or social reason to add to it. The effect of this was that every sentence she produced had a weight and clarity that sentences produced by people who used more words often lacked, because she had already edited. She had told him something on the first day of their rotation that he had written down immediately and returned to several times since. She had said, watching him complete a warm-up sequence, "You talk to yourself when you're solving a problem in movement." He had blinked. Out loud? Under your breath, she said. Not words. Sounds. Like your voice is running the process in the background. He had not known this about himself. He had verified it by asking Kendo, who confirmed it immediately, and Tokage, who said she had assumed he knew, and Pony, who said she found it endearing, which made him cover his face with both hands for a moment. Kodai's quirk was scale manipulation, the ability to resize objects within certain parameters. In combat application this was versatile in ways that he found himself genuinely absorbed by, because the tactical possibilities of being able to make a small object large and a large object small on demand, in the middle of a dynamic situation, were compounding in every direction he ran the analysis. She used it with the same economy she used words. Not show, not demonstration, not excess. Exactly what was needed, at exactly the moment it was needed, and then done. Training with her was like training with someone who had already processed the session in advance and was running it on a track they had laid in their own thinking. She did not appear to be deciding anything in the moment. She appeared to be executing decisions that had been made before the moment arrived. He mentioned this on the 4th day, because it was something he wanted to understand better. Pre-session analysis, she said. You plan the session before we start? I model it, she said. I run the probable exchange patterns based on your documented movement tendencies and prepare response sets. The session is then a calibration of the model against reality. He stared at her. You run combat projections before training? Yes. How detailed? She considered this. Detailed enough to account for your 12 most common movement patterns, the 6 variations I have observed you deploy under pressure, and 3 possible responses to each. He was quiet for a moment. Yanagi researched my nutritional requirements. You pre-model our combat sessions. He paused. Is this a class 1B thing or is this personal, she said, completing the sentence with the decisiveness of someone who has made a choice and does not see the point in obscuring it. Oh, he said. Yes, she said. They trained. She was, as always, extremely efficient. He was, as always, extremely thorough. The combination produced sessions that moved faster than most of his other partnerships while covering more ground, because efficient and thorough turned out to be complementary in the specific way that different but compatible things are complementary. On the last day of their rotation, she said, during the cooldown, "You are doing well." It was not a common assessment from her. He looked up. Thank you. Not the training, she said. Here. In the class. The adjustment. A pause. You are doing it with more care than was required. I think everything worth doing deserves care, he said. She looked at him. I know, she said. That is what I mean. She picked up her bag and walked to the facility door with the clean, unhurried stride that he had come to associate with the particular kind of person who moves efficiently through space because they have a clear picture of where they are going. He stayed on the mat for another few minutes, running the day's session through his internal analysis, and he found that the session was very hard to separate from the conversation that had run alongside it, and that the two together had produced something he could not categorize as purely professional, and that this was, by this point in November, a feeling he was familiar enough with to recognize without requiring the recognition to alarm him. He was finding his footing. Day by day and session by session, he was finding the footing in something that had not existed 6 weeks ago and that was now as real and present as the floor under his feet in the training hall. He picked up his bag. He went back to the dorm. He ate dinner with Awase and Shishida, who were good company, and asked him about his week with the uncomplicated friendliness of people who had decided to welcome him without making the welcoming complicated, and he answered honestly and felt, as he often felt now in the evenings in the Class 1B common areas, that he was somewhere he was supposed to be. Chapter 15, the night before the assessment. The quarterly assessment was on the last Thursday and Friday of November, and the night before was the kind of night that assessment eves at UA always were, a specific quality of focused energy that ran through the residential halls like a current, muted but present, everyone in their own particular relationship to what tomorrow required of them. The study group convened in the common room at 7, which had been the established time for 4 weeks now and had acquired the status of a standing appointment rather than something that needed to be organized each time. By 7:15 the long table had its usual configuration of open textbooks, notebooks, color-coded cards, and the particular accumulation of small personal items that people bring to spaces they have begun to feel proprietary about. Izuku had made tea. This had become his contribution to the group's pre-session setup, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had done it once in the 3rd week when he arrived first and found the kitchen already warm from the previous evening and the electric kettle just within reach, and the following week Komori had set out the mugs before he arrived, and the week after that Pony had brought a new kind of tea she had found in the school store and left it next to the kettle with a note that said for the sessions, and now it was simply something that happened, a small ritual that belonged to the group the way small rituals belong to groups that have existed long enough to develop them. He distributed the mugs. He sat in his usual place, which was the seat that had, over the weeks, become his usual place through the simple repeated fact of his choosing it, across from Kendo and 2 seats down from Yanagi and with the window at his left shoulder and the door at his back. The session was lighter than most because everyone had been preparing individually for weeks and the group sessions had already covered the material, and what remained was the specific work of settling the knowledge into the kind of calm readiness that produced good assessment performance rather than the anxious knowledge that produces the opposite. Tokage was reviewing her tactical analysis notes with the laid-back confidence of someone who knows the material and is doing the review as a courtesy to herself rather than a necessity. Shiozaki was sitting with her hero ethics text but not reading it, which Izuku read correctly as the posture of someone who has internalized the material to the point where looking at the text is simply a way of sitting with something familiar before a significant day. Komori was making extremely small sketches in the margin of her physical science notes that appeared to be mushroom cross-sections but that she had explained to him previously were a form of tactile memory reinforcement that worked better for her than traditional rereading. At 9:15, when the session was winding down and people were beginning to gather their materials and direct themselves toward bed, Kendo said, without looking up from her clipboard, "Everyone. Good work this term. Tomorrow is a formality." It was, coming from Kendo, approximately the equivalent of a motivational speech from anyone else. The class received it as such. People began to filter out. Izuku stayed to collect the mugs, which was another small thing that had become his without announcement. He was rinsing them in the kitchen when he became aware that someone else was still in the common room and that the someone was Itsuka Kendo. She was standing at the window with her clipboard at her side, looking out at the UA grounds in the way that people stand at windows at night, not watching anything specific but using the dark outside as a thinking surface. "You should sleep," he said from the kitchen doorway, because it was true and because he had, somewhere in November, become someone who said true things to her without excessive negotiation about whether to say them. "I will," she said. "I'm just running the tomorrow list." "It's a good list," he said. "You've prepared everyone extremely well." She turned from the window. "I sometimes wonder if I overmanage," she said. It had the quality of a thought she had been sitting with for a while. "If the way I organize things is more about needing the structure than about what anyone actually needs from me." "Can I tell you what I think?" he said. "Yes. I think the structure is real and valuable and that Class 1B functions better because of it. I also think you do it because you care, not because you need the feeling of control. Those look the same from the outside sometimes, but they feel different from inside. Yours feels like care." He paused. "I've been inside enough managed situations to know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, how do you know that?" "About what mine feels like?" "Because you check whether people need the structure," he said. "You adjust when they don't. Someone managing for the feeling of control doesn't check. They just structure." He met her eyes across the common room. "You check." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her clipboard and made a small notation on something, which he recognized as what she did when she had received information she was filing. "You're observant," she said. "I have notebooks," he said. She laughed. It was the real laugh, the smaller private one that he had learned to distinguish. "Good night, Midoriya," she said. "Good night," he said. "Kendo." She paused at the door. He saw her make a small decision, the kind of decision that is visible if you are watching closely. She turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, "from someone who watches people's management styles professionally. You have been the easiest person this class has ever had to include. Not the simplest, I don't mean simple. Easy. Like there was already a space for you and you walked into it without pushing anything out of the way." He absorbed this. "I don't know if I've ever been called easy before," he said. "I've mostly been called intense." "Intensely easy," she said. "Good night." She left. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with the last clean mug in his hand, thinking about intensely easy and about the specific quality of being in a class where the person who managed everything had a space already designated for him in the management. He went to bed. He slept well. In the morning he took the assessment with the rest of Class 1B, and he did well, and they all did well, and afterward in the common room that evening there was the comfortable noise of a group of people who had done what they prepared for and were now in the pleasant specific space of having it behind them. He sat in the middle of it and felt, with a clarity that surprised him by its lack of complication, completely and specifically at home. Chapter 16, December's Architecture. December reorganized things in the way that the end of terms always does, compressing the schedule and expanding the emotional space available, because the practical urgency of assessments and training evaluations lifted slightly and what remained was the residential reality of people who had been in the same building for months and knew each other in the accumulated specific way that shared daily life produces. The Class 1B dorms in December had a quality that Izuku found he was actively grateful to be inside. Someone, in the first week, had put lights along the common room windowsills. He suspected Komori, because the placement had the same warm specificity as her attention to the small things that made a space feel lived in. The study group table had been decorated, at some unspecified point, with a small ceramic mushroom that appeared to be store-bought but had been painted over by hand, clearly and recently, in colors that bore no particular relationship to any mushroom that existed in nature but that managed to be extremely cheerful anyway. He had been in Class 1B for 2 months. In 2 months he understood clearly now, not adjusted to the class, adjusting was the wrong word for what had happened. He had become part of it. The class had been a thing before he arrived and it was still that thing, but it had extended to include him in the way that a living system extends, not by creating a separate section but by integrating the new element into the existing network until the boundary between the element and the network is no longer precisely locatable. He thought about this on a December Saturday afternoon while he was in the common room working on his first full analysis of Class 1B's collective tactical profile, which was something he had been building since October and that had become, over the months, one of the most detailed single-class analyses in any of his notebooks. He had 17 individual profiles and was working on the integration document, the part that addressed how the whole became more than the sum, and he kept finding himself writing things that were not purely tactical. He found himself writing, of Kendo, her leadership creates safety rather than hierarchy, which means the class moves toward difficult things rather than away from them, because the moving is made possible by the safety. He found himself writing, of Yanagi, her precision creates an environment in which the imprecise feel supported rather than judged, because her standards are applied to herself before they are applied to anything outside herself. He found himself writing, of Pony, her adaptability has produced in her a form of generosity that is rare, the specific generosity of someone who has had to build their understanding from the outside and has therefore developed a patience for the outside perspective that most inside-born understanding lacks. He realized, writing portraits. Not tactical profiles. Portraits. He stopped typing. He looked at what he had written. He looked at the room around him, at the window lights and the painted mushroom and the faint sound of people in adjacent rooms doing the Saturday things of people who are comfortable in their shared space. He looked at his own handwriting on the open notebook beside the laptop. Class 1B, he had written at the top, 2 months ago, on the first day. Below it, now, were 2 months of accumulated understanding. The names he had written with blanks where the people had not yet resolved into information he could file. The names had not been blank for a long time. The people had not been unfiled for a long time. What had happened instead was that the file had kept growing until it was something that the word file did not adequately contain. Setsuna Tokage appeared from the direction of the kitchen corridor with a mug in each hand and the focused unhurried quality of someone who has decided to be somewhere and has arrived there without drama. She set one mug on the table beside his notebook without being asked. It was the right kind of tea, which meant she had been paying attention at some point to what kind of tea he drank, which by now was not surprising but which he still noticed. Writing about us again, she said, settling into the chair across from him with the ease of someone in a place they have entirely claimed. Writing about everything, he said. The tactical profile is becoming something else. What is it becoming? He looked at the notebook. I think it's becoming something I'm going to need to be honest about, he said. With myself and with. He paused. With people who are in it. Tokage looked at him over her mug with the observational quality that was her native mode. You've been processing for a long time, she said. October and November were your processing months. I respect thorough processing. She smiled. December feels different though, doesn't it? It did. He thought about why it felt different and arrived at an answer that was simple enough to be almost embarrassing in its directness. It felt different because the processing was complete. He had done the work of understanding what was happening, understanding the shape of it, understanding himself in relation to it. He had arrived at the place where continued processing was no longer processing but delay. Yes, he said. December is a good time, she said. Things that have been waiting tend to move in December. Something about the light and the end-of-year quality. People get honest. She drank her tea. Or maybe I'm just projecting because I've been honest for months and I've been waiting for you to catch up. I'm caught up, he said. She looked at him. Are you sure? I'm sure, he said. I'm sure. I know what I feel and I know what it means and I know what I want to do about it. He looked at the notebook, at the portraits he had written without intending to write them. I want to talk to them. Properly. One at a time. Not announce something, not make a declaration. Just be honest. Because they were honest with me, each of them in their own way, and I've been doing the internal work and they deserve the honest return on it. Tokage was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Midoriya. Yes? That is exactly right. She stood up, stretched, picked up her mug. I'll leave you to your portraits. She walked toward the residential corridor and paused at the entrance. For what it's worth, from the person who has been watching this the longest. This is going to be good. Not complicated good, not difficult good. Actually good. You are someone that multiple people can love at the same time without it being less. That's not common. You should know that about yourself. She went. He sat with what she had said and the words she had used and the specific weight it had in his chest, the weight of something that had been approaching for 2 months and had now arrived at the distance where it was impossible to pretend it was not there. He picked up his pen. He did not return to the tactical profile. Instead he opened to a new page and he wrote, at the top, the same way he always started, Class 1B, December. And then below it, he began to write the honest version. The real version. The version that was not a file or a profile or an analysis but simply, in his own handwriting, the truth of where he had arrived and who he had arrived there for. Outside the window the December light was doing what December light does in the late afternoon, going low and golden and specific in the way of something that will not last but that is, while it is present, worth looking at directly. He wrote for a long time. Act 3, The First Honest Conversation. Chapter 17, The First Honest Conversation. He chose Kendo first, not because she was the most important, that was a ranking he refused to construct, but because she had been the first to create the architecture of welcome that everything else had been built on, and because he understood, from 2 months of observation, that honesty offered to Kendo was never wasted. She would know what to do with it. She always knew what to do with things. He asked her on a Monday evening in the second week of December, after dinner and before the common room filled with the general residential noise of the evening, catching her in the specific window when she had finished her class president tasks for the day and had not yet transitioned to her personal preparation for the next one. She was in the kitchen refilling her water bottle and he said, simply, Can I talk to you? Properly? She looked at him. She understood immediately what properly meant, because Kendo always understood the full content of a sentence, not just its surface. She capped her water bottle. Yes, she said. They went to the small study room at the end of the residential wing that was used often for exactly the kind of conversation that needed a closed door, not for secrecy but for the quality of attention that a closed door allows. It had 2 chairs and a window that looked out at the winter trees and a lamp that made a warm circle of light on the table between them. He had thought about what he wanted to say for long enough that the words were organized, but organized did not mean easy and he sat for a moment with them before beginning. I want to be honest with you about something, he said. About what I've been finding out about myself over the past 2 months. About what it means for how I feel, and specifically about how I feel about the people in this class. About you. She set her water bottle on the table. Her hands were still. I'm listening, she said. When I arrived in October I was focused on fitting in and being useful and not disrupting what was here. I was treating it like a new deployment, like entering a context that required me to minimize my own signal and maximize my responsiveness to the existing environment. He looked at her. I stopped doing that in November. And when I stopped doing it, I started actually noticing what was happening around me, what had been building toward me, from you and from others. And I spent November processing that honestly. And, she said. The word was quiet and patient. And I feel something specific about you, he said. Not a general warmth. Not just professional respect, though I have that, or gratitude, though I have that too. Something that is more particular than those things. Something that has the quality of, I think the word is. He searched for it with the care he gave words he wanted to be accurate. Of wanting. I want to know you more than I currently know you. I want to be the kind of person you tell things to when they matter. I want, when something good happens to you, to be near enough to know about it and to be glad about it with you. He paused. I don't know if that has a category yet. I'm not asking it to. I just wanted you to know it was there because you deserve to know true things about how people feel about you, and I am apparently not capable of being in the same space as you without it being true. Kendo was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the winter trees held their stillness in the way of trees that have shed everything and are resting in the fact of themselves. Midoriya, she said. Yes. Do you know how rare it is for someone to say exactly what they mean without dressing it up or diminishing it or leading with all the reasons it might be inconvenient? I've been told I'm very literal, he said. You're honest, she said. There's a difference. Literal people say what they see. Honest people say what they feel, which is harder. She met his eyes. I want you to know something true about me in return. I noticed you on the first day. Not the reputation, not one for all, not the rankings, you. The way you stood at the door for 23 seconds before you knocked, which I clocked from the frosted panel because I was watching. The way you sat down and opened your notebook before you'd said a word to anyone. The way you looked at the class as if it was something you wanted to understand rather than something you needed to perform for. A pause. I've been president of this class for over a year. I know when someone wants to belong to something and when someone wants to understand it and earn the belonging. You were the second kind. That was the first thing I knew about you, and it made me want to know everything else. He absorbed this. You watched me for 23 seconds from the frosted panel? She smiled. The small direct one. I was being thorough. Thorough, Kendo, he said. She laughed, real and unguarded. Where did that come from? Pony calls me thorough, Midoriya, he said. It seemed fair. The laugh settled into a warmth between them that had the quality of something that had been present for weeks and had now been named without being diminished by the naming. He felt, sitting in the circle of the lamp in the small study room with the winter trees outside, that this was the kind of moment that would stay in the category of things that mattered when he looked back later. What happens now, he said. Now we figure out what we are, she said. Without rushing it and without pretending it's simpler than it is. But from an honest foundation. She picked up her water bottle. I think that's the only kind of foundation worth having. I think so too, he said. They stayed in the study room for another hour and talked about things that were not the main subject and were therefore exactly the right things to talk about after the main subject had been addressed, her first year at UA and his, All Might's retirement and what it had meant to both of them from different directions, the specific difficulty of being the person a group of people relied on and learning to rely on people in return. When they left the study room, the residential corridor was quiet with the late evening quiet of a building moving toward sleep, and they walked toward the stairwell in the comfortable warmth of people who have told each other true things and found the truth workable. Good night, Kendo, he said at the stairwell. Good night, Izuku, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed. He was fairly certain she knew he noticed. He went upstairs with the specific feeling of someone who has taken a first step in a direction that the rest of the journey will follow, and the ground under the step was solid. Chapter 18, Tokage already knows. Setsuna Tokage did not need to be told. He had understood this in principle since October. He confirmed it in practice on the Wednesday morning after the Kendo conversation, when she appeared at his desk before first period with the air of someone arriving at a conclusion they have already reached. Good conversation Monday, she said. How do you know I had a conversation Monday? You look like someone who has been carrying something for 2 months and put it down, she said. Also, Kendo said good morning to me this morning with the specific quality of someone who went to sleep satisfied about something she does not currently want to discuss but that she is not trying to hide. Those 2 data points together are not ambiguous. He looked at her. Tokage. Yes? I need to have an honest conversation with you as well, he said. Not right now, before class. Later. She looked at him with the particular quality of someone who already knows the content of a conversation and is prepared to receive it gracefully anyway. Okay, she said. Lunch? Lunch, he agreed. They ate on the east side of the cafeteria, at the corner table that afforded the best view of the room and the least likelihood of being overheard, which Tokage had chosen with the deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be and had already optimized the setting for it. He told her. He had refined the telling somewhat from the Kendo conversation, not because the content was different but because Tokage was different, and what was honest for one person required different framing to be honest for another without being less true. He told her what he felt and what it meant and what he wanted, and he told her without dressing it up because dressing things up with Tokage was a waste of both their time and she would see through it immediately and find the waste mildly offensive. She listened with her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, looking at him with the full engaged attention that she usually kept partially in reserve, deployed only for things she found genuinely important. When he finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been watching you since October." "I know," he said. "I watched you figure out you liked Kendo. I watched you figure out you liked Yanagi. I watched you figure out you liked Pony and Komori and Shiozaki and Kodai. I watched you figure out you liked all of us and then watched you spend November processing the implications with the methodical thoroughness of someone dismantling a very complicated piece of machinery to understand how it works." She tilted her head. "What I watched was the most extended and careful exercise in emotional processing I have ever personally witnessed. And I want you to know that I found it, and I find you, wonderful. In the specific way. You understand what I mean by the specific way?" "I think so," he said. "Good." She sat back. "I have one question." "Yes. Are you sure?" She said it without pressure. It was a genuine question, the kind asked by someone who wants to be certain the answer is real rather than reactive. "Not about the feeling. I believe the feeling completely. About the whole of it. About being in the middle of something this large and being, genuinely, okay with it. Not managing it, not performing okay. Actually okay." He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved, because it was the right question and she was the right person to have asked it, and it would be a diminishment of both to answer it quickly. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have spent my entire life being afraid that I was not enough. Not strong enough, not smart enough, not qualified enough to be what I wanted to be. That fear was the running current under everything." He paused. "Something that has happened here, in this class, over these months, is that I have felt, I don't know how else to say this without it sounding like I'm overstating it, I have felt like enough. Just as I am. Not because of what I can do with One for All, not because of rankings or assessments, but because people in this class saw who I was before those things and wanted to know more. And that is." He looked for the word. "It is the thing I did not know I was missing. And having found it, I am not afraid of the size of it. The size of it feels appropriate." Tokage looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Okay," she confirmed. "That's the real answer. That's what I wanted to know." She picked up her chopsticks. "Now eat. You have afternoon training at 2 and you need the calories." He ate. She talked, about other things and about the specific things, weaving between them with the ease of someone who was comfortable in the full spectrum of conversation and did not need the register to stay constant. She made him laugh twice, and she did it deliberately, the second time in particular, with the timing of someone who knows exactly where the landing is and walks out to meet it. When lunch was over and they were walking back toward the classroom block, she said, without preamble, "You know I'm going to be the person who tells you things you need to hear even when they're inconvenient." "I assumed," he said. "Good. As long as we're clear." A pause. "I think you're going to be the person who makes everything in this class better. Not because you're exceptional, though you are. Because of who you are when you're not being exceptional. That person is the one I've been watching since October. And that person is exactly what I said he was when I said it." "Wonderful," he said. "Don't push it," she said, but she was smiling with the whole of her face and he knew the instruction was aesthetic rather than substantive. He went to afternoon training feeling lighter than he had felt in weeks, in the specific way of someone who has begun a process they had been putting off and found that the beginning was better than the anticipation of it. Chapter 19, Yanagi in the library. He found Yanagi in the library on Thursday afternoon, which was where she was most Thursday afternoons, at the corner table by the tall window that had the best reading light and the fewest interruptions, which she occupied with the ease of someone whose claim on a space has been established through consistent presence rather than declaration. She looked up when he approached. She always looked up at exactly the right moment, as if she had been aware of his arrival for several steps and had chosen the appropriate moment for acknowledgement. He had stopped being unsettled by this and had started finding it specifically comforting, the sense of being accurately tracked by someone who meant it well. "Midoriya," she said. "Do you have a moment?" he said. She closed her book with the deliberate precision she applied to physical objects, marking the page first with a thin ribbon. "Yes," she said. He sat across from her. The library was quiet around them with the specific quiet of a space that curates silence as a feature. Outside the tall window the December afternoon was the color of pewter, flat light on the grounds, the kind of day that turns the interior warm by contrast. He told her what he had told Kendo and what he had told Tokage, adjusted once again for the specific person across from him, for Yanagi who communicated in precision and who would receive imprecision as a form of disrespect even if it were unintentional. He used the most accurate words he could find. He said what he meant without preface or qualification, not because he wanted to be abrupt but because with Yanagi, the absence of preface was itself a form of respect, an acknowledgement that she did not require management. When he finished she sat for a moment with the stillness that was her thinking posture, her hands folded on the closed book, her eyes on the table between them in the way that meant she was processing rather than avoiding. Then she looked up at him. "I have something to tell you," she said. "That I have been carrying since October and that I did not know how to offer without it seeming disproportionate." "Tell me," he said. "I have been more interested in one other person since I began at UA than I had been in the general population of this institution," she said, with the specific care of someone for whom clinical language is not coldness but precision, and who has chosen to be precise rather than approximate about something important. "I am naturally a person who finds most social interaction to be effortful rather than restorative. The effort is manageable and I have calibrated for it, but it is present. With you it is not present." She paused. "This began on your first day. The calibration I normally require simply did not engage. You were, from the beginning, in a different category. I did not announce this because I was uncertain what to do with the certainty of it. Certainty about people is not common for me. When it occurs I tend to observe it carefully before acting on it, because my certainties tend to be durable and the durability requires that I be confident they are real rather than reactive. And after 10 weeks, he said. "It is durable," she said. Simply. As a statement of fact that required no further qualification. He looked at her across the table in the pewter light. "Yanagi," he said. "The 47 pages. A small thing happened in her expression. It was not a large movement. For someone less practiced at reading Yanagi it would have been invisible. But he had been reading her for 2 months with the specific attention she had, early on, provoked in him, and he saw it clearly, the slight easing that happened when a thing that has been held carefully is received with the care it was offered in. "Yes," she said. "That was you telling me," he said. "Before you knew how to tell me another way." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said again. "I'm glad I found it," he said. "I'm glad I put it back and waited until I understood what I was receiving. Because I think I understand it now more completely than I would have if I'd addressed it directly in October." "You processed it in the correct sequence," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite warmth but was what warmth became in a person who ran primarily on precision, the specific quality of approbation from someone whose standards were high and who extended it sparingly. He thought this might be one of the most meaningful compliments he had ever received, and he received it accordingly. They sat in the library for another 45 minutes. She resumed her reading. He opened his notebook and wrote, which was to say they occupied the same space in the way that two people who are comfortable with each other occupy a shared space, doing different things and not requiring the other to be doing the same thing in order to feel the companionship of the proximity. When the library's quiet hour ended and the space began to fill with the after-school traffic of students returning from training, she gathered her book and her materials with the same precise economy of motion that characterized everything she did and stood. "Midoriya," she said. "Yanagi. Thank you for coming to tell me directly," she said. The directness was appropriate. I thought you would prefer it to indirection, he said. Considerably, she said. And then, which was unusual for her, I look forward to the next 10 weeks considerably more than I looked forward to the first. He watched her move through the library with the quiet self-contained certainty of her particular way of occupying space, and he thought that there was something specifically remarkable about a person who contained so much interior life and offered access to it so selectively, and that the selectivity made the access, when given, feel like something real and considered rather than reflexive. He wrote this in his notebook on the train back from the library. And then he wrote, below it, I think what I feel for her specifically is something like reverence. Not in a distant way. In the way of someone who has been permitted into a space they understand to be private and are determined to deserve the permission. Chapter 20, Pony tells him first. The conversation with Pony did not go the way he had planned it, because Pony had her own timeline and her own version of directness that was specifically and characteristically hers, and it arrived before his planned conversation, on a Friday morning at the start of their language session, with the unprompted quality of something that has been waiting for exactly this moment. He had barely sat down and opened his English grammar workbook when she said, looking at her own notes with the careful lateral gaze of someone delivering something important while maintaining the option of retreat if it lands badly, I want to tell you something that is maybe too direct for this time of morning. But I have been thinking about it for several weeks, and I think if I wait any longer I will lose the nerve, and if I lose the nerve it will not have been said, and I think it should be said. He put the workbook down. Tell me, he said. She looked at him. Pony had a way of making eye contact that was completely without the social management that most eye contact contained, the calibration of how much to show and what to suggest and when to look away. She looked at people the way that people who have learned to see look at things they are seeing, fully and without the editing. I like you, she said. In English. Then, switching to Japanese with the fluency that continued to surprise him even after months of sessions, not in the general way. In the specific way. I thought about how to say it for a long time, and I decided that the most honest thing was to say it simply and in both languages, because I think important things should be said in every language available. She folded her hands on the table. I have been thinking about you since October. In the specific way. I wanted you to know. He sat for a moment with what she had said, receiving it with the care she had offered it. Pony, he said. Yes? I was going to talk to you today, he said. I have been working up to it for a few days. You beat me to it. She blinked. Then a smile started, small at first and then growing into the full bright version. You were going to tell me? I was going to tell you, he said. The same kind of thing. Specific. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating a situation they had been preparing for that has turned out to be different from the preparation in a better than expected direction. Then she laughed, the bright clear laugh that he had been hearing twice a week for months and that he understood now with the understanding that comes from paying particular attention, was one of the best sounds in his current daily life. We are both so careful, she said. Both of us, so careful. Both writing notes and thinking about timing, and then we both get here at the same time and it turns out the timing was the same. It happens that way sometimes, he said. Yes. She was still smiling. Can I ask you something? Of course. The language sessions, she said. Have they been? Have you been coming because of the English? Or also because of other things? He thought about the question honestly. I came the first time because of the English, he said. I kept coming because of both. The English got better. Something else was also getting better at the same time and I did not know what to call it for a while. I know, she said. I also had a word problem. In 2 languages. She looked down at the grammar workbook. Shall we still do the session? Yes, he said. I don't want to stop the sessions. I want the sessions to keep happening for a long time. She looked up. Good, she said. Me too. They did the session. His English was noticeably better than it had been in October, not excellent, not near her level of fluency, but better in the specific way that consistent practice produces improvement in things that have a natural ceiling you might not reach and an incremental improvement that is nonetheless genuinely satisfying. She corrected him 3 times and praised him 4 times and the ratio felt right, the way things that are well calibrated feel right. At the end of the session, as they were gathering their materials, she said in English, "Next week. Tuesday. The usual time?" "The usual time," he said. In English. With better pronunciation than he had managed in October. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone acknowledging a measurable outcome. "You have improved," she said. "Both things." He looked at her. She was smiling with the particular quality of someone who has said something with two meanings and is satisfied that both landed. He thought, walking back toward the classroom block in the cold December morning, that this was one of the qualities he found most specifically appealing about Pony Tsunotori, the way she could mean two things at once without the meanings competing, as if her nature was wide enough that multiplicity was not a problem but simply the natural shape of how she engaged with the world. He had a feeling that quality was going to continue to be relevant for a long time. Chapter 21, Komori's Afternoon. He showed Komori his notebooks on a Saturday afternoon in the second week of December, which was what he had promised and which she had not forgotten, appearing at the entrance to his room at 2 in the afternoon with the cheerful punctuality of someone who has been looking forward to a thing and sees no reason to be late for it. He had, before she arrived, experienced a brief and intense moment of reconsideration, because his notebooks were extremely personal in the way that the inside of a person's thinking is always personal, not in the sense of containing secrets, but in the sense of containing the unedited process, the half-formed observations and the crossed-out conclusions and the moments where his handwriting changed because his emotional state had changed mid-sentence. Opening that to someone else felt, briefly, like a more exposing thing than the conversations he had been having all week. Then he thought about the way Komori had said chaos is just organization that hasn't been mapped yet, and the brief moment of reconsideration resolved. She sat on his desk chair. He sat on the bed. He handed her the most recent notebook first, the one that started on the day he arrived in Class 1B, because that seemed like the correct starting place. She opened it with the careful handling of someone who understood that they were holding something that mattered and wanted to hold it accordingly. She began to read. He had expected to be nervous while she read. He was not particularly nervous. He watched her read with the same attention he gave everything, watching the small expressions that moved across her face as she moved through the pages, the focus, the occasional small nod, the moment when she reached the first entry about her own quirk and her face went entirely still in the way of someone receiving something they did not fully anticipate. She read for 20 minutes. He did not interrupt. He had learned, in the months of knowing Komori, that she moved through things at her own pace and that her pace was always the right pace for her, neither rushed nor indulgent but simply accurate. When she looked up her expression was one he had not seen on her before, quieter than her usual brightness, not less warm but more concentrated. "Mycelial network," she said. "You wrote mycelial network in October. In the first week," he said. "Nobody has ever used the correct biological term for it," she said. "Not Vlad King, not the other students, not, I looked it up once, any published analysis of my quirk type in the hero database." She looked at the notebook. "You looked it up. I look everything up," he said. "When something interests me." She was quiet for a moment. "This is how you are interested in things," she said. "You find out what they actually are?" "I try to," he said. She held the notebook carefully in both hands. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Of course. When I was younger," she said, "before UA, people treated my quirk like a decoration. Like something pretty and a little weird. Nobody asked about the biology. Nobody thought about the tactical layers. And I started to believe them a little. Not completely. I always knew there was more there. But the not being asked made it easy to let the knowing sit without doing much with it." She looked up at him. "You asked. You went and found out without being asked to. And that made me want to do more with what I know." A pause. "I've been doing more with it since November." Vlad King noticed in the last assessment. He asked what changed. "What did you tell him?" "That someone showed me that the details mattered," she said. He did not know what to do with this for a moment. The weight of it was larger than he had anticipated and he had anticipated considerable weight. "Komori," he said. "Yes? I need to tell you something as well," he said. "In the same direction." About what I feel and what it means. She looked at him with the complete open warmth that was her native mode, all of it directed, right now, entirely at him. Okay, she said. He told her. He had gotten better at this across the week, not because the feeling was less each time but because he was finding the more accurate shape of the words that were specific enough to be true for each person rather than general enough to be true for no one in particular. What he said to Komori was about warmth and about the quality of her attention and about the way she made every space she was in feel inhabited rather than merely occupied, and about the way her mind worked, the biological analogy mind, the chaos as uncharted organization mind, and about the fact that sitting in a rain-closed training room listening to her talk about spore propagation had been one of the best hours of his first 2 months in the class. When he finished, she set the notebook on the desk beside her with the same careful handling she had opened it with. Then she leaned forward and hugged him. It was not a long hug. It was the specific kind of hug that Komori gave. He had received one once before after a difficult training session, warm and complete and entirely without self-consciousness, the hug of someone who had decided that physical warmth was a legitimate form of communication and deployed it accordingly. He received it accordingly. When she sat back, she had the quiet, concentrated version of her expression again. I feel the same, she said. In the same direction. I have felt it for a while. I did not know if it was something that could exist alongside everything else that exists in this class. I am still figuring that part out. So am I, he said. That seems like the right answer, she said. That we are both figuring it out. Rather than one of us having figured it out and the other catching up. I don't think anyone is ahead, he said. I think we are all figuring it out in parallel. She nodded slowly. Then the brightness came back into her expression, the usual warmth, but with the concentrated quality underneath it now, the layer he had been given access to. I am going to make you tea, she said, standing with the decisiveness of someone who has received a large thing and is processing it through practical action. And then I want to look at the notebook entry about my quirk from October and I want to add annotations, because I think I can expand on at least 4 of your observations. I would be genuinely grateful for the annotations, he said. She took the notebook to the kitchen. She made the tea. She annotated 4 entries and 1 additional one she found in November. Her annotations were written in round, cheerful handwriting that was completely different from his angular, hurried script and that turned the pages into something collaborative, 2 systems of understanding the same thing from different angles, which he thought was a very accurate representation of what had happened in the room that afternoon. Chapter 22, Shiozaki and the Winter Garden. The UA campus had a small winter garden on the east side of the main building, a glassed-in space that the Botanical Science Department maintained through the cold months, and that was, in December, the only place on campus where things were still growing in the full committed way of living things rather than the dormant way of things waiting for spring. Ibara Shiozaki spent time in the winter garden when her thoughts required a particular kind of company, which was the company of growing things rather than the company of people, not as a preference for the one over the other but as a recognition that different conditions supported different kinds of thinking, and that some of the harder thinking she needed to do was best done where the air was warm and humid and smelled of green. He found her there on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of December, which he had known she would be because he had paid attention to her patterns in the way he paid attention to all of them, and because the winter garden was where she went when something was sitting with her that had not yet resolved, and he had noticed, in the past week, that something was sitting with her. The winter garden was perhaps 40 feet long and 20 wide, glass walls and glass ceiling, the light coming through diffused and even. The plants inside were a careful curation of species that managed winter well or that came from climates where winter was not a concept they had been required to learn. In one corner, a variety of vine plant had been encouraged up a wooden trellis, not unlike the controlled growth of Shiozaki's own quirk, which he did not think was an accident. She was standing beside the trellis with one hand raised and the vine growing from her hair extended to touch its climbing counterpart with a delicacy that was not quite training and not quite communion but somewhere between the two. I thought you might be here, he said from the entrance. She withdrew the vine with the gentle motion of returning a thing to its usual place. She turned. Yes, she said. I come here when I need to think in the right direction. What direction are you thinking in? He said, entering and letting the warm humid air of the space close around him. About you, she said, with the honesty she applied to everything, the honesty that came from a worldview in which pretending not to feel what you felt was a form of dishonesty she could not accommodate. He walked to the open space beside the trellis and stood close enough to be present but not so close as to crowd her particular quality of needing room. I came to tell you something, he said. But if you need to go first, I want to hear you. She was quiet for a moment, the winter garden quiet around them, the particular silence of a space where things were growing rather than resting. I have been in conversation with myself, she said, about what it means to feel something for someone who, by all visible evidence, exists in the feelings of several people simultaneously. I had concerns about whether my feelings in that context were appropriate. Whether the context itself was something I could accept as a good thing rather than a complicated one. And, he said. And I examined the concern carefully, she said. I did not dismiss it because it was inconvenient. I gave it the full weight it deserved and I asked myself whether my resistance was principled or whether it was, and I want to be honest about this, whether it was simply unfamiliarity wearing the costume of principle. He waited. He had learned to wait for her, that her thinking always arrived at its destination and that interrupting the route diminished the arrival. It was unfamiliarity, she said. The principle, when I examined it properly, did not object. The principle requires that I am honest, that I cause no harm, that I engage with integrity. None of those things are in conflict with what I feel or with the situation in which I feel it. She looked at him. What I feel is genuine and it has been present since early in the term and it did not diminish when I examined it closely. Things that do not diminish under close examination tend to be real rather than reactive. Yes, he said. I know the distinction. I thought you would, she said. He told her then, the version shaped for her, for the person whose language was both the most grounded and the most elevated of anyone he knew, who thought in the long view and the moral dimension and who deserved to hear not just the feeling but the intention behind the feeling. He told her that what he felt for her specifically was something he associated with the word regard, not in the diminished sense in which regard was sometimes used as a lesser version of stronger words, but in the full sense, the sense of holding someone in careful and respectful esteem, of thinking about their well-being and their flourishing with genuine investment. He told her that he found her one of the most consistent people he had ever known, consistent not in the sense of predictable but in the sense of aligned, always the same person regardless of context, and that he found this quality rare and specifically admirable and specifically attractive in the sense of drawing him toward her, wanting to be near someone that aligned because being near her made him feel more aligned himself. She listened with the full quality of her attention, the vine from her hair resting against the trellis behind her as if she had placed it there deliberately to keep her hands free. When he finished she said, I want to ask you something. Yes. What you have described. What you feel for me and what you feel for the others. Does it feel to you like it diminishes when distributed? Or does it feel like each form of it is complete in itself? He had thought about this question, not in these exact words but in the territory they occupied. It feels complete in itself, he said. What I feel for you is not a portion of a thing divided by a number. It is its own thing. It has the shape of you in it. It couldn't be given to anyone else because it is made of what is specifically you. She was quiet for a long moment. The vine touched the trellis. The winter light came through the glass ceiling in its diffuse even way. That is the answer, she said, that I hoped was true and was not certain was possible. It is true, he said. She nodded slowly, the movement of someone who has received something important and is placing it correctly. Then I have no remaining concerns, she said. Only this. She took a step closer. Not closing the distance entirely, but reducing it to the distance of people who have made a decision to be near each other. She reached out and touched, briefly and deliberately, the back of his hand with the tips of her fingers, and then withdrew, and the touch lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained everything it needed to contain. Thank you for coming to find me, she said. Thank you for being somewhere findable, he said. She smiled, and in the winter garden with the growing things around them and the even light above, the smile had a quality he had not seen in her before, lighter than her usual expressions, as if something that had been weighing had been properly placed and the weight was now distributed in a way she could carry without noticing it. Chapter 23, What the Group Becomes. By the last week of December, the honest conversations had been had with 6 people, And the class had arrived at an understanding of itself that was different from the understanding it had had in October, in the way that living things are always different from their earlier forms while remaining recognizably themselves. The understanding was not announced. It did not require announcement. It was present in the room the way that the temperature in the room is present, felt before it is registered, known before it is articulated. The class still functioned exactly as it had functioned, the study sessions and the training and the meals and the common room evenings and the small routines that had accumulated into the texture of their shared life. But the texture had another layer now, something that ran underneath the surface function like a current, warm and directional. The 4 boys in the class, Awase and Kaibara and Shishida and Tsuburaba, had arrived at their own understanding of the situation with a speed and equanimity that Izuku found, privately, somewhat remarkable. Awase had addressed it with him directly, in the way Awase addressed most things, which was with the forward momentum of someone who had already processed and was moving on. Okay, so the class has a vibe, Awase had said on a Thursday afternoon with complete equanimity. Class 1B always has a vibe. This is just the current vibe. It seems like a good vibe. You seem happy. The girls seem, engaged. It all seems fine. He had shrugged with the specific shrug of someone who has genuinely processed and accepted a situation and is not performing the acceptance. You're a good person and you're a good classmate, and whatever is happening seems like it's making everyone better, and I am choosing to regard it as a class-wide positive development. Shishida had said, in his more measured way, the important thing is that the dynamic continues to support the class's development as a unit. From what I observe, it appears to be doing so. That is the relevant consideration. Kaibara had nodded once and returned to his work. Tsuburaba had said sure with the specific tone of someone who has no particular objection and does not see the point of elaborating on the absence of objection. Izuku had found their responses unexpectedly moving in the way that simple acceptance sometimes is when you have been prepared for something more complicated. On the 23rd of December, 2 days before the class dispersed for the winter holiday, Kendo organized a dinner. Not a formal dinner, not announced as anything other than she said in the group chat, "We should eat together properly before break," which was the kind of thing she said and the class responded to by simply arriving. They filled the large common room table, all 21 of them, with the particular expansive noise of a group of people who had been eating together in smaller configurations for months and were now experiencing the full version of each other simultaneously. Someone had brought a portable speaker. Komori had made something involving a mushroom variety she described as deeply underrated in Japanese cuisine, and that turned out to be excellent. Yanagi had, without comment, produced from somewhere a set of matching chopstick rests that elevated the table setting from functional to considered, and nobody mentioned this but everyone used them. Izuku sat near the middle of the table, which was where he had been directed by the general traffic of people finding seats, and looked at the room from that position with the quality of attention he had been giving it for 3 months and found that the looking had changed. In October he had looked at Class 1B as something to understand, a system to analyze, an environment to fit into. In November he had looked at it as something he was becoming part of, the adjustment still in process, the integration still feeling effortful in the good way of things worth effort. In December, looking at the room from the middle of the table with the noise and the warmth and the food and the 20 people who had become, over 3 months, the specific 20 people who had become the people, he found that he was not looking at it at all. He was inside it. There was no looking at anymore. He was part of the view. Kendo, from her end of the table, caught his eye. She raised her cup slightly, the smallest possible gesture. He raised his in return. She smiled and looked away, and the exchange lasted 2 seconds and said everything it needed to. Tokage was 3 seats down, in full narrative flight about something that was making Pony laugh with the genuine unguarded laugh she gave when something had genuinely delighted her. Yanagi, beside Tokage, was watching this with the specific expression he had come to read as her version of warm participation, attentive and present and not requiring herself to be louder than she was. Komori was on Pony's other side, adding something to Tokage's story that complicated and elevated it, the way she added to everything, finding the detail that made the whole more interesting. Shiozaki was listening to all of this from across the table with the gentle half-smile that she wore when she was in a group she trusted and did not need to manage her presence. Kodai, 2 seats to his left, turned briefly to him during a lull in the immediate conversation around them and said, "Good dinner." "Very good dinner," he agreed. She nodded once and returned to eating. It was, from Kodai, approximately equivalent to a speech. He thought, somewhere in the middle of the meal, about the night he had stood outside the classroom door in October and counted to 23. He had been standing on the outside of something then, listening through frosted glass to the sound of people who knew each other well. The counting had been his brain doing what it did when the rest of him was too uncertain to function. He had not been uncertain in some time. The counting had stopped. He was on the inside now. Not of the frosted glass, not of the sound heard from outside, but of the thing itself. And the thing itself was warm and loud and smelled of Komori's excellent mushroom dish and had 20 people in it, each of them distinct and specific and known to him in the specific way that knowledge built through daily proximity and honest conversation builds, the kind you could not rush or manufacture but could only receive, incrementally and genuinely, from people who had decided to offer it. He received it. He held it carefully. He understood, sitting at the middle of the table in the last week of December with his first semester in Class 1 coming to its close, that what had happened to him here was not something he would have chosen or designed or anticipated, and that the impossibility of anticipating it was part of its nature, the part that made it specifically what it was. He was the kind of person, it turned out, who could be in the middle of something large and not be diminished by the size of it. Tokage had been right about that. He had not believed her fully in October. He believed her now, from the inside, where the evidence was immediate and continuous and very warm. Away said something loud from the far end of the table and the whole room responded with laughter, the full group kind that arrived like weather, and Izuku laughed too, the real unguarded kind, and the sound was indistinguishable from the sound of the room around him. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, home. Chapter 24, Holiday and Return. The winter holiday lasted 2 weeks, which was a duration that he understood intellectually was restful and appropriate and that he nonetheless experienced as somewhat longer than 2 weeks in the specific subjective way that time expands when you are in the middle of something that matters and have been temporarily displaced from the center of it. He went home to his mother, who received him with the warmth and the excellent cooking that had always been the specific character of coming home, and who asked him with the precise attentiveness of someone who had been paying attention to his voice over monthly phone calls how he was actually doing. He told her. He told her in more detail than he had managed on the phone in early December, sitting at the kitchen table with the tea she made and the winter sounds of their neighborhood outside and the specific comfort of a space that had been home long before UA had become home in its different way. She listened to all of it. When he finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You sound different than you did in September." "Different how?" he said. "You sound settled," she said. "You've always been Izuku. But there was always a part of you that was waiting to be somewhere, like you knew the place existed and you were moving toward it but you hadn't arrived. You sound like you've arrived." He thought about this. "I think I have," he said. "Good," she said, with the simple completeness that she had always had for saying the right thing in the shortest possible form. "Good." He spent the first week of the holiday working on his analysis notebooks and running his training schedule in the community center gym and eating his mother's cooking with the particular appreciation of someone who has been eating cafeteria food for months and has remembered what home cooking actually is. He texted the class chat daily, not at length, just the small presences that maintained the connection across the distance, and the class responded in the way of people who were comfortable in each other's absence because they were secure in the return. Kendo texted him on the 27th with a photograph of something she was reading, the cover of a tactical analysis text he had mentioned in passing 2 months ago, with a message, "Found it at the bookshop at home. You were right, the first chapter is very good." He spent 20 minutes crafting a reply that conveyed genuine enthusiasm without reading as excessive and landed on, "I knew you would like it. The chapter on decision lag is the best one." She replied, "Agreed." He saved the exchange in the specific way he saved things he wanted to be able to return to. Yanagi texted him on the 2nd of January with a research paper attachment and a single line, relevant to the quirk interaction discussion from November. He read the paper, which was dense and excellent, and replied with 3 pages of notes on it. She replied to his 3 pages with 2 sentences that reorganized his 3 pages into a significantly more elegant argument. He read those 2 sentences several times and then wrote, in his notebook, "Her mind works the way a very good editor works. It does not add. It clarifies." Pony sent voice messages, which was her preferred medium for communication at a distance, in a mixture of Japanese and English that had the warm informal quality of their sessions and that he played back more than once. The last one of the holiday ended with, in English, "I am looking forward to Tuesday." He played that one 4 times. Komori sent him photographs of mushroom species she had found on a family walk, labeled with their common and scientific names and brief annotations on their ecological role and potential quirk application possibilities. He sent back a photograph of a notebook page where he had begun a new entry on her quirk incorporating the annotations she had added in December, with space left deliberately for the new information. She sent back a row of small mushroom illustrations she had drawn in the margin of her notebook. He printed one and put it on his desk. Shiozaki did not text often, which was consistent with her general relationship to technology and that he had learned to understand as not absence but simply a different mode. She sent one message on the 5th of January, 3 days before the return. "I have been thinking about what you said in the garden. It continues to hold." He read it once and replied, "It continues to hold here too." She did not reply further and he did not need her to. Kodai sent a message on the return day itself, the morning of January 8, terse and precise as everything from her, returning at 9. He replied, "Me too." She replied, "Good." He found this exchange, in aggregate, very satisfying. He arrived back at the Yui dorms on the evening of the 8th with his bag and his notebooks and the specific quality of anticipation that was not quite the nervous anticipation of October but something steadier and warmer, the anticipation of someone returning to a place they had been away from and looking forward to the return without the uncertainty about whether the place would still be there. The dorm common room was warm. Someone had turned the window lights back on. The ceramic mushroom was on the study group table where it always was. There was a new variety of tea on the shelf beside the kettle that had not been there before the holiday. Komori, he thought immediately. She had been here first. He put his bag down and made tea and sat in the common room and waited, not anxiously, in the comfortable patient way of someone who knows the people they are waiting for are coming and that the waiting is simply the last small part of an absence already almost over. The first person through the door was Pony, with her bag over one shoulder and the bright forward momentum she brought to everything. She saw him at the table and her face did the thing it did, the full warm brightness, and she crossed the room and sat across from him without saying anything first, the way that people who know each other well sometimes establish presence before language. Then, "Hi," she said. In English. "Hi," he said back. In English. With good pronunciation. She smiled with the complete version of the smile. "Welcome home," she said. He looked at the common room, at the lights and the mushroom and the new tea and the familiar furniture and the door through which 11 more people would arrive in the next hour. "Thank you," he said. And meant it, in every direction the word could travel. Chapter 25, January and the Work of Things. January at UA had a specific character that was different from any other month in the school year, a quality of renewed seriousness that was not grim but purposeful, the institution returning to itself after the holiday pause with the focused energy of something that knows what it is for and is ready to be it again. Class 1B returned to its schedule with the ease of a well-maintained mechanism resuming operation, which was, Izuku thought, one of the more impressive qualities of a class that had been building its shared infrastructure for over a year. There was no re-warming up period. They simply continued from where they had been, because the continuity had been maintained through the holiday in the ways that mattered and the break had been a rest rather than a disruption. He continued from where he had been, too. Which was a new experience. His previous transitions, into UA, into Class 1A, into the hero world that existed beyond the school grounds, had all required adjustment periods, recalibrations, the work of establishing himself in a new context. January in Class 1B did not require this. He came back already established. The place he occupied in the class had not closed while he was gone. It had waited. The second term brought new training structures and a new assessment cycle and a partnership rotation that had him working with Setsuna Tokage in the first week, which he approached with the understanding that training with Tokage would be a different experience than training with Kendo or Yanagi or Kodai, because Tokage brought to every situation the quality of someone who was simultaneously fully present and fully amused by the situation, as if she was watching it from a slight angle even while being in the middle of it. She was also a genuinely difficult person to fight against, which he had understood from observation and confirmed in the first session with the kind of bodily understanding that only comes from being in the same space as a quirk at full engagement. The detachment application was the obvious part. She could separate parts of herself and control them independently, which created a combat geometry that was fundamentally different from anything that had a fixed center, because she did not have to have a fixed center if she chose not to. He had prepared for this. What he had not fully prepared for was the speed of the detached unit's response to her direction, which was faster than he had estimated from observation, and the way she used this to create feints that were not feints at all, moments where what looked like a withdrawal was actually a preparation and what looked like an attack was actually a redirect. "You underestimated the response time," she said, during the first water break, cheerfully. "By approximately a quarter second," he agreed. "A quarter second is a lot," she said. "A quarter second is everything," he said. She laughed. "I know. I've been working on it all term. The response time was my primary improvement target for November and December. It paid off. It absolutely paid off," he said with the genuine professional appreciation of someone who respected hard-earned improvement. She looked at him with the observational quality that was never entirely off, even in the middle of training, the part of her that was always mapping. "You're easier to fight now," she said. "Easier? In a good way. Not weaker. Easier to read. You're fighting from a settled place. When I trained with you in October on the joint exercise, you were fighting from not an anxious place, but a proving place. Like you were in a conversation with yourself while you were also in the training. Now you're just in the training." She tilted her head. "It's much better to fight someone who is just in the training." He thought about this. "I didn't realize it was visible." "Everything is visible if you know what to look for," she said. "And I always know what to look for." He could not argue with this and did not try. The second week brought a new component to the second term schedule, which was a collaborative project between Class 1B and a group of second-year students focused on inter-year knowledge transfer and the specific question of how first-year students could most effectively absorb practical experience from those who had already navigated the situations they were moving toward. Izuku was assigned to a study group with 3 second-year students and 2 classmates from 1B, and his 1B groupmates were Itsuka Kendo and Ibara Shiozaki. He met with them on a Wednesday afternoon in one of the project rooms, and the 3 of them fell into the collaborative mode that their months of shared study sessions had established without requiring re-establishment, which impressed the second-year students and which Izuku found quietly satisfying in the way of confirmation that something you suspected was real continuing to be real on examination. After the second-year students had left, Kendo lingered with the quality of someone who has a small thing to say and is deciding whether the moment is right for it. "Izuku," she said. He had still not entirely adjusted to his first name in her voice. He did not think he was going to adjust to it fully. He thought this was, probably, the point. "Itsuka," he said, because if she was using his name, using hers felt like the right reciprocity and he had been waiting for the moment to offer it. She was quiet for a second. The quiet of someone receiving something they had expected and finding the reality of it different from the expectation in a way that required a moment. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Now that it has had a month to settle into something I'm sure of." "Yes," he said. "The conversation in December," she said. "The small study room. I have thought about it every day since." "Not obsessively. In the way that you think about things that have changed the terms of something important. I think about it and I feel the terms have been changed for the better and I wanted you to know that." She met his eyes. "You said you wanted to be someone I told things to when they mattered. I'm telling you this. It matters." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you told me," he said. "It matters to me too." She nodded, once, the way she nodded when something was settled properly. "Good," she said. "Are you going to dinner?" "In about 20 minutes, he said. "Walk with me," she said. They walked through the January building, through the corridors that were becoming known to him in the specific way that spaces you have been in during many different states of mind become known, layered with context, and he thought that the walk itself was one of the things he would not forget. Not because anything dramatic happened during it, but because it was the kind of ordinary thing that accumulates meaning through the state of the people doing it, and the state of the people doing it was, in this case, the state of two people who had told each other true things and found the truth workable and were now walking to dinner in the easy way of people who have settled the terms of something important and find the settled terms comfortable. They ate dinner with the class, as they did every evening, and the table was what it always was now, warm and full, and he was what he had been for a month, the person at the center of something large and managing the center with the care it deserved, and the care was genuine, which made it sustainable, which made it the kind of thing that was going to last. He wrote in his notebook that night, at the end of a page that had been full of January training observations and tactical notes, the terms have been changed for the better. He had underlined Kendo's words when she said them, internally, and he underlined them now on the page. And then, below the line, in the smaller handwriting he used for things that were most his, I am learning, this year, what it means to be in the middle of something that makes you larger rather than smaller. Every day in Class 1B I am a better version of what I was the day before, not because I am performing better or training harder, but because the people around me create the conditions in which being better is possible. I did not know that was something a class could do. I know it now. And I am going to spend the rest of this year being worth what they have offered. Act 4, The Remaining 11. Chapter 26, The Remaining 11. January moved with the purposeful momentum of a term that knew what it was doing, and Izuku moved with it, and underneath the daily rhythm of training and study and meals and the accumulated small habits of a class that had been living together long enough to have habits, there was the ongoing and patient work of the honest conversations he had not yet had. 6 done. 11 remaining. He had not set a timeline for the remaining 11, because the honest conversations were not a checklist and he was not completing them in order of priority. They were happening as the moments presented themselves, which was the only honest way for them to happen, because a moment manufactured for the purpose of a declaration was a lesser thing than a moment that arrived naturally with the declaration inside it. He was aware, from the quality of attention around him, that the 11 who had not yet had the direct conversation knew something was in process. Class 1B was a class of people who paid close attention to their environment, which meant it was a class of people who could feel the shape of something moving through the room even when the movement had not yet reached them directly. Nobody pressed. Nobody asked. The patience was its own form of trust. Manga Fukudashi was one of the people he understood least well in the early weeks, not because she was reserved, she was not, she communicated with the cheerful expressiveness of someone who had grown up in a household where feeling things loudly was the standard, but because the expressiveness was so genuine and so consistent that it took him longer than usual to locate the specific person underneath the general warmth. He found her on a Tuesday afternoon in the common room, laughing at something on her phone with the open unself-conscious laugh of someone who did not edit their responses for audience. She had a quirk that allowed her to generate comic-style effects, sound effects made visible and physical, which in combat was substantially more devastating than the aesthetics suggested, and in daily life created an environment around her that had a particular texture, slightly more vivid than baseline, as if someone had turned up the contrast slightly on everything within range. She noticed him noticing and waved with the economy of movement of someone comfortable with attention. Midoriya. You have your looking at something expression. I have a looking at something expression, he said. Distinct and consistent, she said. Slightly tilted head. Eyes going somewhere specific. She mimed it with affectionate accuracy. You have been looking at me with it for approximately 20 seconds. I was thinking, he said, sitting down nearby with the ease that came from months of the common room being a space he occupied comfortably, that I don't know you as well as I should by now. Given how long we've been in the same class. She put her phone down and gave him her full attention, which was a considerable amount of attention when deployed entirely. Okay, she said. Ask me things. He liked this immediately. What do you actually love about your quirk, he said. Not the tactical application. What do you love about it? She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough to be notable. Nobody asks that, she said. I'm asking. She thought about it with the genuine consideration of someone who had the answer but had not been asked to articulate it before and wanted to do it right. It makes the internal external, she said. When something is really funny, I cannot just laugh at it inside myself. The laughter becomes a thing in the world. When something surprises me, it makes a sound. When I'm delighted, it shows. She looked at him. Most people spend a lot of energy making their insides invisible. My quirk makes mine visible. I used to be embarrassed about that when I was younger. Now I think it's the most honest thing about me. He wrote that sentence in his notebook later, word for word, because it was the kind of sentence that deserved to exist somewhere durable. I think that's extraordinary, he said. Not just the quirk. The way you think about the quirk. She tilted her head in the way that meant she was receiving something and checking whether it was genuine. She was very good at this. The perpetual external expression meant she had spent more time than most people processing the difference between performed sincerity and actual sincerity, because she had had to navigate both more visibly than most. You mean it, she said. I always mean it, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then the brightness in her expression shifted in quality, from the general warmth to something more specific and more directed. Midoriya, she said. I want to tell you something. Tell me, he said. And she told him, in the direct expressive way that was her nature, that she had liked him specifically since the 3rd week of October, when she had watched him spend 45 minutes at the study group going through Tsunotori's grammar exercises with a patience and a genuine interest that had made her put down her own notebook and watch. She said she had almost said something then and had not because she had not known how it would land in a class she was still understanding. He told her, in return, what he had been telling people, the specific form of it that was true for her, for the person who made the internal external, who was honest about her own nature in the particular way of someone who had come to terms with visibility and found it freeing. The conversation generated, because it was fukidashi, a small visible sound effect at its most significant moment, a warm rounded shape in the air between them that was not text but that had the quality of something that had been expressed and would not go back to being unexpressed. He thought about that for a while afterward. The honesty made material. He understood, sitting across from her in the common room with the contrast of everything slightly elevated, that this was what it looked like when someone's inner nature and their outer expression were the same thing, and that there was something specifically beautiful about it. Chapter 27, Kanoko's Theory. Kanoko Komori had a theory about how Class 1B functioned that she had shared with Izuku on a January evening when they were washing up after dinner, and the conversation had moved, as conversations between them did, from the immediate and practical into the more structural and interesting. The theory was biological in its framework, because Komori's theories tended to be, which he had come to regard as one of the more reliable features of knowing her, the consistent application of a worldview that had been built from the ground up through the study of living systems. The theory was this: a mycelial network, which was the structure underlying fungal communities, did not have a center. It had nodes. Each node connected to multiple other nodes through threads of various strengths, and the health of the whole was not determined by the strength of any single node but by the density and quality of the connections between them. A mycelial network could lose nodes and remain functional. It could add nodes and incorporate them without disrupting the existing connections. It was, in a word, resilient in a way that centralized systems were not, because it had no single point of failure. Class 1B is a mycelial network, she had said, setting a clean plate on the drying rack with the same careful precision she brought to everything in the kitchen. We are not organized around a center. We are organized around our connections to each other. And me, he had said, drying the plate and placing it on the stack. She had thought about this, washing the next dish with the focused attention of someone who takes even small tasks seriously. You are a node that increased the density of the network, she had said. When you arrived, existing connections got stronger. Not because you replaced anything. Because you added connection points that were not there before. She had looked at him sideways, with the concentrated version of her warmth. A healthy mycelial network always knows when to incorporate something that will make it more resilient. He had stood with the clean plate in his hands for a moment. That is, he had said, the most genuinely beautiful thing anyone has ever said about my transfer paperwork. She had laughed the real laugh, the whole face version, and the kitchen had been bright with it. He thought about the theory often in January as the remaining conversations happened, each one at its own pace and in its own context, because it clarified something that he had been holding somewhat abstractly. He was not at the center of a wheel with spokes extending outward. He was a node in a network that had other connections he was not part of, and the health of those other connections was part of what made his own position sustainable. The network was real and it was robust and it included him and it was not about him, and the not being about him was part of why it worked. He told Komori this, 2 weeks after the theory conversation, when they were in the common room in the late afternoon and the light was doing the good January thing of coming in low and specific through the west windows. She looked at him with the concentrated warmth. "You understand it," she said. "I'm learning it," he said. "It helps to have someone who can explain it in terms that make the biology visible." "Everything is biology eventually," she said, with the serenity of someone who has arrived at a worldview and finds it consistently confirmed. "I'm beginning to think you're right," he said. She smiled. And then, because she was Komori and she moved through the world with the directness of someone who had decided that physical warmth was a legitimate and primary language, she reached over and touched his hand briefly on the table, the same way she touched plants when she wanted to check on them, not grasping, not demanding, simply acknowledging that something was there and that she was glad it was. He did not move his hand. He let the touch be what it was, which was simple and genuine and characteristic of the person offering it, and he thought that the quality of Komori's warmth was one of the things that made the mycelial network metaphor most accurate, because warmth like hers did not diminish through distribution. It was not a finite resource being shared out. It was a renewable thing, generated continuously, and the nodes that received it were made more conductive, more able to pass it on to the next connection. He was going to write that in the notebook later. He was going to write it with specific attribution because she deserved the credit for making him think it. Chapter 28, Pony and the Second Month. The language sessions in January had a different quality than the language sessions in October and November, not because the format had changed. They still met on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at 7, not because the work had changed. He still needed the English practice and she still benefited from the Japanese immersion that conversation with a native speaker provided, but because the people doing the format and the work had changed, had been changing continuously since October, and were now in January operating from a foundation that the October versions of them did not have. The difference was legible in small things. The way the chairs in the lounge had over the months been angled slightly toward each other rather than facing the table directly, an adjustment so gradual that neither of them had made it deliberately but that had happened through the accumulated small movements of people positioning themselves toward the person they were in conversation with rather than toward the task they were ostensibly doing. The way the session sometimes started before the notebooks were open, beginning with the conversation about something that had happened since the last session, which was a choice they both made implicitly and that told him something about what the sessions had become in addition to what they had always been. Pony was, in January, one of the people he understood most specifically and most completely, which he attributed to the format of knowing her, which was twice a week over several months in the specific intimacy of the language exchange, a format that produced a particular kind of knowing because language learning required vulnerability in a way that other shared activities did not. You could not fully guard yourself while mispronouncing things and asking what words meant and searching for constructions that were almost there but not quite. The vulnerability was built into the activity, which meant the knowing that accumulated around the activity had a depth that was earned rather than assumed. On a Tuesday in the third week of January she arrived with a book he had not seen before, a small paperback with a cover illustration of an ocean. She set it on the table between them. "My grandmother sent this," she said. "For my birthday. It is a Japanese novel but published also in English." She said reading something you love in both languages is the fastest way to close the gap between them. "When is your birthday?" he said, with the specific sharpness of someone who realizes they have missed something they should have known. She looked at him. "The 18th of January? Yes. Pony," he said. "That is 4 days ago." "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you say anything?" She looked faintly amused in the way she looked when she was watching someone have a realization that she had been waiting for without impatience. "I am not a person who announces my birthday," she said. "It is a personal preference. I prefer birthdays to be quiet things that happen to me rather than events that are organized around me. That is a preference I respect, he said, and I still wish I had known. What would you have done, she said. It was a genuine question, the kind she asked when she was curious about how he thought. He considered it. I would have made sure to find you before anyone else found you on that morning, he said. And I would have told you something true about the specific person you are on the specific day that marks another year of being that person. He paused. I think that is what birthdays deserve. Not a party. That particular kind of specific attention. She was quiet for a moment. The morning light came through the lounge window in the particular January quality, clear and flat and bright. Izuku, she said. Using his first name, which she had moved into in December as naturally as breathing. Yes? That is exactly the right answer, she said. That is precisely what I would have wanted and did not tell anyone I wanted because I was not sure anyone would understand it. I understand it, he said. I know, she said. That is why I told you. He looked at the book between them. Tell me what the novel is about, he said. In both languages. We will use it as the session material. She picked up the book with the warmth of someone holding something that carries affection within it, not just from the grandmother but from the language itself, the specific relationship she had with Japanese that was made of effort and time and the particular love that comes from earning something that did not come naturally. She told him about the novel in Japanese and then told him about it again in English, and the two versions were different in the ways that the same story is always different in different languages, because some things exist in the space between languages rather than in either one alone, and understanding both versions was the only way to access the thing in the space between. He listened to both with the specific quality of attention he brought to Pony specifically, which was the attention of someone who understood that what she was saying was always also about how she was saying it, and that the how was as important as the what because it was in the how that the person was most completely present. At the end of the session, gathering her materials, she said without looking up, in the casual register of someone mentioning a small thing, next year I will tell you about my birthday before it happens. Next year, he said, the words landing with the weight of an assumed future, which was a specific and good weight. Next year, she confirmed, and looked up with the private smile that had been his specific version of her expression since December, and he received it with the same warmth it was offered in, and the morning went on into the rest of the day. Chapter 29, Ibara in February. February at UA brought a practical assessment cycle that required each student to demonstrate what the assessment documentation called individual quirk mastery under dynamic conditions, which was the formal language for being put in situations that your quirk had to solve without the support structure of a team. It was the kind of assessment that revealed, as Vlad King had observed during the briefing, not what you can do when the conditions are right but what you are when the conditions are not. Ibara Shiozaki went into her assessment on a Wednesday morning and came out of it on a Wednesday afternoon with the slightly distant expression of someone who had encountered something difficult and was in the process of integrating it. Izuku, who had his own assessment the following day and was in the observation corridor when she emerged, fell into step beside her without quite deciding to, because she had the quality of someone who could use company without requiring it to announce itself. They walked for a while before she spoke. I have been thinking, she said, about the limits of strength applied in isolation. How did the assessment go? He said. Not poorly, she said. But it revealed something I have been aware of and have not fully addressed. My quirk at its most precise requires a form of stillness that dynamic conditions do not allow for. The precision and the dynamism are in tension. She paused. I have been working around this tension rather than through it. Working around rather than through is a reasonable response until you have the tools to go through, he said. Yes, she said. I am developing the tools. He thought about what he had observed of her quirk over the months, the way it moved and the way the vine needed its moment of connection before full precision. Can I offer something? He said. Please, she said. The stillness you need for precision, he said. It is interior, not physical. You do not actually need to be physically still. You need to be interiorly still while physically moving. That is a different skill set than physical stillness. It is closer to what you do in conversation when you are listening to something important. You can be in motion and be entirely centered at the same time. You do it in conversation routinely. She was quiet for several steps. That is, she said, an extremely useful reframe. Your vine hesitates because your attention hesitates, he said. Not because your body moves. If you keep the interior attention consistent through the physical movement, I think the hesitation reduces significantly. She turned to look at him, with the specific quality she had when something had reorganized something else inside her thinking and she was still in the process of feeling the reorganization settle. You have been watching my quirk very carefully, she said. Since October, he said. She was quiet again, but it was the thoughtful quiet rather than the processing one, the quiet of someone who has received information and is now experiencing something adjacent to the information rather than the information itself. Izuku, she said. Yes. I want to tell you what I have been thinking about since December, she said. I have told you that the garden conversation continues to hold. I have not told you what, specifically, it continues to hold. Tell me, he said. They had reached the bench by the covered walkway that ran between the main building and the east training block, the one that caught the February light through the glass panels above in a way that made a particular quality of interior afternoon. She sat. He sat beside her. I have been thinking about what you said, she said, about what you feel being complete in itself. Having the shape of the specific person in it. And I have been testing this statement against my own experience of what I feel for you, to see whether it holds in both directions. Does it? He said. Yes, she said. What I feel for you is not a portion of what it would be if the situation were simpler. It is its full amount. And the full amount has, in it, things that are specifically about who you are and that could not be transferred to another person any more than a vine can take root in a surface that is not suited for it. She looked at the light coming through the glass above. I wanted you to know that I have verified this. That it is not something I accepted on faith in December. I examined it and found it to be structurally sound. You verified it, he said. I verify everything, she said. Before I accept it as true. I know, he said. I find that quality in you one of the most reliable things I have encountered this year. She looked at him. He looked back. The February light made everything in the covered walkway very clear and very specific, and he thought that this was one of the qualities of winter light that he had underappreciated before this year, the way it removed the softening and left the thing itself visible, without the diffusion of summer, without the drama of autumn, just the object and the light on the object and the truth of what was there. Thank you for the reframe, she said. I am going to apply it in training next week. Tell me how it goes, he said. I will, she said. And then, with the deliberateness that characterized the moments when she chose to be less measured than her default, I am glad you fell into step with me. I am glad you let me, he said. They sat in the February light for another few minutes before the afternoon training schedule reassembled itself around them and they went back to the business of the day, and he thought all afternoon about interior stillness and physical motion and whether it was something that applied equally well to the kind of movement that was not physical at all but that he had been making since October, the movement towards something large, and concluded that it probably did, and that he had been doing it intuitively for months without having the language for it, and that having the language now was one of the gifts of knowing someone whose language was always precise. Chapter 30, Yui in the evening. Yui Kodai did not change. This was something he had established over 4 months of observation and that he continued to confirm in January and February with the specific satisfaction of someone finding a consistent result across multiple trials. Where other people shifted register depending on context, where even the most consistent people had their moments of being further from their center than usual, Kodai was always Kodai. The same quality of attention. The same economy of language. The same small movements that communicated more than most people's paragraphs. He had been thinking, in the second week of February, about how to have the remaining honest conversation with her, not because he did not know what he wanted to say but because he understood that with Kodai the how of the saying was as important as the what. Too much preamble and she would be waiting for him to get to the point. Too abrupt and the point would land without the context that made it not just information but communication. He needed to find the natural moment. The natural moment presented itself on a Thursday evening when he was in the second-floor study corridor looking for a reference text he had misplaced and encountered Yui Kodai sitting on the window seat at the end of the corridor with her index cards sorted in her lap and the winter evening outside making the glass of the window into a dark mirror. She looked up when he approached. She looked at the empty space beside her on the window seat. She looked back at her index cards. He sat down. They did not speak for a few minutes. He had found, over the months, that this was one of the specific qualities of her company that he valued without being able to fully articulate why, the fact that being in a space with Yui Kodai did not require either of them to fill the space with sound in order for the space to feel occupied. The silence with her was not empty. It was full of the particular content of two people being present in the same place and not finding that presence insufficient. Eventually she said, without looking up from her cards, "You have something to say." "Yes," he said. She continued sorting the cards. "Say it," she said. He gathered what he wanted to say and said it cleanly, because that was the right form for Yui Kodai. He told her that he had been aware, since early November, of what she had communicated in the training session when she said the word personal, and that he had been sitting with what he wanted to say in return for the right moment. He said that what he felt for her specifically was something he associated with the quality of her consistency, the way she was always Yui Kodai regardless of the context, and that he found this quality, the reliability of a person who did not perform differently for different audiences, one of the most specifically beautiful things he had encountered this year. He said that he wanted, for as long as they were in this class and beyond it, to be someone whose presence she did not have to perform for, someone who knew the Kodai behind the economy of language well enough to understand what the economy was choosing not to say. He finished. He waited. She was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than her usual processing beat. Then she set the index cards on her knee and looked at him with the full quality of her attention, which was rarely given to a single thing for long and which therefore had a weight when it arrived. "Behind the economy," she said. "Yes," he said. "You understand that the economy is not concealment," she said. "It is just what I am." "I know," he said. "I am not looking for what is hidden. I am interested in what is there, in the form it is actually in." She held his gaze for several seconds. Yui Kodai's eye contact was not the calibrated kind, not the managed kind. It was the kind of someone who looked at what they were looking at because they had decided to look at it, and the looking had weight. "Yes," she said. He waited to see if there was more. There was a pause, then. "I have been observing you since October," she said. "I do not tell people things I observe about them without purpose. I told you about the secondary shoulder effect because I needed you to know it and you were the most direct recipient of the information." A pause. "I have observed other things that I have not told you because the purpose of telling them was not yet clear to me." "What things?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, sorting through what to give him and in what order, in the way she sorted her index cards, by category and relevance. "You eat less on days when you have had a difficult training session than on days when you have had a good one," she said. "This is counterintuitive because the difficult sessions burn more calories. I have been leaving extra food near your seat on difficult session days for 3 months. He stared at her. "The food near my seat at dinner," he said. "On the difficult days," she said. "I thought that was a serving error," he said. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Kodai." "Yes. You have been feeding me for 3 months based on a caloric observation you made in October." "Yes," she said. "As if this were ordinary. You and Yanagi have been managing my nutrition from opposite ends of the methodology spectrum," he said. Something very small happened at the corner of her expression. It was the Kodai equivalent of a smile. "Yanagi's approach is theoretical," she said. "Mine is applied." He laughed. He did not mean to laugh, but it arrived before he could do anything about it, and once it was there it was real and unguarded, the genuine kind. And something happened in response that he had not seen before, which was that Yui Kodai, in the window seat in the February evening, let the small thing at the corner of her expression become something slightly larger. Not a full smile. More than the corner. The category between those two things that had no standard name but that was unmistakable when it was there. "I feel the same," she said, returning to the direct statement that was her natural mode after the brief detour into humor. "In the direction you were speaking. The observation you made in November was accurate. It remains accurate." "I'm glad," he said. "Yes," she said. She picked up her index cards and returned to sorting them. He stayed on the window seat beside her in the February evening and did not feel required to fill the silence, and the silence was full of everything it needed to be full of, and eventually he found the reference text he had been looking for because Kodai, without being asked, reached into the stack beside her and produced it. "You knew I was looking for this," he said. "I saw you looking," she said. He took the text. He said thank you. She said nothing and continued sorting her cards. He stayed until the corridor lights came on for the evening and then went back to his room, feeling that the window seat conversation had been exactly the right length and that Yui Kodai was, specifically and particularly, someone he was very glad to know in the increasing depth that he was coming to know her. Chapter 31, Reiko and the Research Hours. The thing about Reiko Yanagi, which he had been assembling into a complete picture over 4 months of daily proximity, was that she was most herself in the morning hours before 9 and in the late evening hours after 9, and that the period between those two windows was not a lesser version of herself but a version calibrated for public operation, for the energy cost of a world that expected people to be available and responsive on its schedule rather than theirs. He had learned this not because she told him but because he paid attention, and the pattern was clear once he had enough data points. The Yanagi who appeared in the study room at 7 on Monday mornings was slightly more present than the Yanagi at the lunch table. The Yanagi who passed him in the corridor at 10 in the evening, returning from the library with a book and a look of complete interior absorption, was the most entirely herself he ever saw her. He adjusted accordingly. He did not require her to be the calibrated version when the natural one was available. He met her in the morning hours when he could. He gave her the corridor space at night when she needed it. He did not perform sociability at her when she was in the mode of not requiring it. She noticed this. He knew she noticed because of the small adjustments she made in return, the ways she extended the morning hours when they overlapped rather than retreating to her natural conclusion time, the way she sometimes paused in the corridor at 10 when she saw his light on and tapped twice on the door to let him know she was passing, which was not a request to be admitted but was a form of acknowledgement that she had developed specifically for him because it fit the particular texture of what they were. In February they began working together in the library on 2 evenings a week, not as a formal arrangement, but as something that had evolved from their separate evening research habits intersecting repeatedly in the same space until the intersection became the plan rather than the coincidence. She worked on her own material. He worked on his. They did not speak extensively during these sessions, which were different from the study group sessions in that the study group sessions had a collective purpose and these had individual purposes that happened to coexist comfortably in the same space. But they spoke enough. She would occasionally turn a page toward him to show him something relevant to a topic he was working on, which she had identified as relevant through the peripheral awareness that was simply how her mind operated, tracking multiple information streams simultaneously while appearing to be focused on one. He would occasionally read something aloud, not asking for a response but sharing it in the way of someone who finds a thing interesting and is in the company of someone who finds the same category of things interesting and who will, therefore, appreciate the sharing. On a Wednesday evening in the second week of February she looked up from her text and said, with the quality of someone offering information they have been carrying for some time and have decided is ready to be offered, "I have revised the nutritional document." He looked up. "The 47 pages? It is now 63 pages, she said. "I incorporated the January training data and added a section on the specific caloric requirements during the second-term combat rotation based on the observed energy expenditure patterns over the past 6 weeks. She placed it on the table between them. "I considered sending it directly this time rather than leaving it in the bookshelf. I prefer the direct approach," he said. "I know," she said. "I am practicing it." He picked up the document. It had the same small precise handwriting. The same organizational structure. 16 more pages of it, which meant 16 more pages of Reiko Yanagi's attention organized into a form that could be offered to him directly, and the directness was itself a thing she was practicing, which meant it was a thing she was doing specifically for him, the calibration in the direction of openness rather than the calibration in the direction of protection. "Yanagi," he said. "Yes. Can I tell you something?" "You may tell me anything," she said. Which was not the form she usually used. The usual form was yes. "You may tell me anything" was something larger. "What you do, which is organize your care into forms that can be useful, he said, is one of the most specifically meaningful things I have ever been the recipient of. Not because the information isn't genuinely useful, it is extremely useful. But because the document is not just information. It is you telling me something in your native language. And I read it in your native language. And what it says, under the nutritional data, is that you are paying attention to me in the specific and careful way that you pay attention to very few things. And being paid that quality of attention by someone whose attention is what yours is, he paused, finding the end of the sentence, is one of the most significant things that has happened to me this year. She was very still. The library was quiet around them. The evening had gone completely dark outside the windows. Then she said, "You read it correctly. I wanted you to know," he said. "I know," she said. "That you wanted me to know is itself significant." They returned to their respective materials. They did not speak for another 40 minutes. But the room had a quality that it had not had before the exchange, a settled quality, the quality of a space where something has been said that was true and that has rearranged the air slightly by being said, and the rearrangement was permanent and comfortable and entirely worth the saying. Chapter 32, The Study Group in February. The study group in February had the quality of a standing institution, which was what it had become after 4 months of Thursday evenings, something that continued not because it was scheduled but because it had become part of the structure of the week in the way that things become structural when they serve a genuine function and the people serving them genuinely want to be there. Izuku arrived on the second Thursday of February to find the room already occupied by 6 people and the table already organized in the configuration that had emerged over the months, which was not assigned but was consistent through the accumulated choices of people finding their natural places and returning to them. He took his seat and made the tea and opened his notebook and was inside the session before the session had formally started, which was how it always was and which he found specifically comfortable, the way that things you have done many times become comfortable through the repetition. The material this month was the midterm preparatory cycle, which Kendo had organized with her characteristic thoroughness into a schedule that distributed the subject load across the available weeks in a way that optimized for retention rather than coverage, which was a distinction that many study programs did not make and that this one consistently had. He worked through the tactical analysis section with the group, and the session had its usual quality of distributed intelligence, each person's strength becoming a resource for the others without requiring management. Tokage's lateral thinking on scenario analysis, Yanagi's reorganizing precision, Kodai's efficiency, Pony's cross-linguistic perspective on hero law texts that occasionally produced an observation that landed differently because she had arrived at it from outside the native framework. Somewhere in the middle of the session, during a break while people refilled their teas and stretched, Kendo appeared beside him at the kitchen counter with the specific quality of someone who has something to say and has found the right moment for it. "How are you?" she said. The question she always asked with the quality that distinguished it from its casual version. "Good," he said. "Better than good, actually. I think this is the best I have been since I arrived." She considered this. "What changed?" "Nothing changed suddenly," he said. "Things accumulated. In the right direction." He looked at the room over her shoulder, at the people settled in their places with their books and their conversations. "I have been thinking about what you said in December. About being intensely easy to include. I think that was generous." "It was accurate," she said. "I think what is actually happening," he said, "is that this class is intensely easy to be included in. The ease is on the offering side, not the receiving side. I showed up and you all made room without requiring me to earn it first. That is not me being easy to include. That is you all being generous enough to include first and let the earning come after." She looked at him for a moment. "You are going to make me revise my assessment," she said. "I think the accurate version is both things," he said. "You made it easy by making room. I made it easy by not taking up the room in ways that pushed things out. Both required something." "Agreed," she said. "Both required something." She picked up her tea. "I find that easier to say now than I would have in October." "What changed for you?" he said. "You," she said simply. "The specific quality of your presence changed what I was willing to say, because you made saying true things feel safe rather than exposing." That is something you do without trying to do it, and it is something I have never encountered at quite this density before. He absorbed this. Itsuka, he said. Yes, she said. Thank you for making room in October, he said. It mattered more than I had the language to say at the time. She held his gaze for a moment. The warmth between them was the February version of the October warmth, the same in direction and entirely different in magnitude, fuller and more settled and not requiring the effort that new things require. Come on, she said. The session is resuming. He followed her back to the table and they took their respective seats and the session continued, and Tokage sent him a look from across the table that had the quality of someone who had been watching from the kitchen counter's sightline and found what she had observed satisfactory, and he gave her a look in return that said he had noticed her noticing, and she gave him a small nod and returned to her tactical analysis notebook. The evening went on. The tea was replenished twice. Pony fell briefly asleep over her hero law text and Komori drew a small mushroom on the corner of her notes as a marker, and nobody woke her because she would not have wanted to be woken, and they all knew this. Shiozaki read aloud a passage from the ethics text that she found particularly clear and asked whether others agreed with the clarity, and they did, or they qualified their agreement in ways that produced a discussion that was better than the individual positions. He sat in the middle of it and worked and listened and contributed and existed in the room in the way he had been existing in the room since December, without the awareness of being in the room that had characterized the first months. He was simply there. It was simply the room he was in. The people in it were simply the people. Not simply. Never simply. But with the ease that felt like simplicity from the inside. He wrote, in the margin of his tactical analysis notes where there was a small free space, month 4. Still learning. Still accumulating. Still getting better at this. And then, below it, in the smallest version of his handwriting, not afraid of the size of it anymore. Just grateful. Chapter 33, March and its weight. March came in with the quality of a term in its final months, when the accumulated progress of a year becomes palpable in everything, in the way people moved through training and the way they responded to each other and the way the classroom had the particular warmth of a space that had been occupied by the same people for long enough that their shared presence was a physical quality of the room itself, something you could feel walking in from the outside. The remaining honest conversations happened in March, not in a rush but in the organic sequence that the moments provided. He talked with Hiryu, whose scale-based quirk he had been studying since November and whose methodical approach to improvement had a quality he recognized and respected. He talked with Juzo Hananuki, whose softening quirk produced a combat application that was genuinely one of the most tactically interesting he had encountered in the first-year cohort, and whose directness had a quality he found refreshing in the context of someone who could, technically, soften the ground beneath his feet and had always chosen not to. He talked, in different moments and different contexts, with each of the remaining members of Class 1B who had not yet had the direct conversation, and each conversation had its own texture and its own specific truth and its own particular form of what was offered and what was received. What he understood, by the end of March, was something that had been building since the theory conversation with Komori in January. The network was not organized around him. He was a node in the network. But the network had, by his arrival and by the months of what had accumulated since the arrival, become more densely connected than it had been before, and the density was good, the health kind of good, the kind that produced resilience and capacity rather than complication. He thought about this on a March afternoon when the weather had shifted enough that the training fields were fully usable again and the class had a free outdoor period that they used differently, some in pairs, some in small groups, some individually in the particular way of people who knew each other well enough to be alone together without the aloneness feeling like absence. He was sitting on the low wall at the edge of the east training field with his notebook when Setsuna Tokage appeared and sat beside him with the ease of someone who had been sitting beside him in various configurations since October and found the position comfortable. Observation mode, she said, looking at the notebook. Reflection mode, he said. The observations have been made. This is the processing. What are you processing? He looked at the field, at the scattered configurations of his class in the March afternoon light. Kendo and Shiozaki in the far corner, running a precision drill. Pony and Fukudashi near the center, working on something that involved considerable laughter. Yanagi at the edge of the field, alone with her book but with the particular quality of solitude that was chosen rather than imposed. Komori by the hedge line, crouched over something at ground level with the focused interest of someone who has found a fungal specimen worth investigating. Kodai on the low wall 20 feet away, index cards in her lap, present in the field in the way she was always present, doing what she was doing and simultaneously aware of everything. I am processing, he said, the fact that I am in the middle of the best year of my life. And that the best year of my life is not what I would have expected the best year of my life to look like. I expected the best year to be the year I fully mastered one for all, or the year I was involved in something that mattered at a large scale, something that changed the shape of hero work. I did not expect it to be the year I transferred to Class 1B and learned what it meant to be known by people who wanted to know me. Tokage was quiet beside him. I didn't expect it either, she said. And I engineered a lot of it. He looked at her. You engineered it? Not the feelings, she said. Those were already going to happen. But I made sure the conditions were right. I watched you in October and I thought, this person is not going to see what is happening around him in time to respond to it properly, because he is too busy trying to be useful to let himself be received. So she paused. I told people what I saw. About what you were. About the kind of person you were. I did not manufacture anything. I simply described accurately, to people who were already paying attention, the thing they were paying attention to. The rest was theirs. He sat with this. Tokage, he said. Yes. You spent October being the narrator of my arrival, he said. Someone had to, she said. You were not going to narrate yourself. You are not that kind of person. I don't know how to feel about this, he said. Feel grateful, she said. That is the appropriate feeling. You are welcome. She stretched with the easy self-satisfaction of someone who has executed a plan successfully and is content with the execution. Also, you would have gotten here anyway. I just shortened the timeline by approximately 2 months. 2 months, he said. You are extremely thorough, she said. It takes time. He laughed. She laughed. Across the field, Pony looked over at the sound and gave a small wave that he returned. And the March afternoon continued in the particular light of a season that was not yet spring but was no longer fully winter, the light that belongs to the time between things, when one thing has ended and what comes next has already begun even if it has not yet announced itself. He wrote at the bottom of the reflection page, the network is healthy. The note is settled. The terms have been changed for the better by each person in turn, and the better compounds, day by day, into something that I no longer have the capacity to fully describe in a notebook because it is larger than what notebooks are for. He closed the notebook. He put it in his bag. He stayed on the wall in the March light and let the afternoon be what it was, which was good, which was his, which was the ongoing lived texture of the year that was still happening and that he intended, fully and deliberately, to continue showing up for. Chapter 34, What Izuku Understands by Spring. Spring arrived at UA with the particular quality of beginnings that happen inside continuities, not the beginning of something new but the returning of something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the light and the temperature to reach the conditions under which it could be visible again. The campus changed with the season in the specific way that a campus surrounded by enough green to have a relationship with the natural calendar changes, the training fields going from the gray-brown of late winter to the particular early green of March grass pushing through, the trees along the east path committing to their buds with the sudden decisiveness of things that have been waiting and have decided the time is right. Izuku walked to morning training on the first day of April and noticed the grass and noticed the trees and noticed the way the light had changed to the rounder, softer version of spring light and thought, with the specific quality of thought that belongs to someone who has arrived somewhere they are glad to have arrived at. This is my second season here. He had arrived in autumn. He had been through winter. He was now in spring, and the spring had the specific quality of being his spring, not a spring he was observing or a spring he was inside by administrative arrangement, but a spring that belonged to the year that had built itself around him and the class that had become his class and the people who had become his people in the specific way that people become yours through the accumulated weight of daily proximity and honest exchange. The training session was a full class outdoor session, All of Class 1B on the East training field in the April morning with Vlad King running a coordination drill that had the complexity of a second semester exercise. Not easy, requiring everyone to work simultaneously and to trust that the others were in their positions and doing their parts without being able to see all of them at once. He had done drills like this in Class 1A, where the coordination had always had a slightly competitive edge, each person doing their best partly because doing your best was right and partly because the others were also doing their best, and the field had a quality of lateral awareness that was not quite pressure but not quite not. This version was different. The field had the quality of distributed trust, everyone operating from the assumption that the others were there, not monitoring, not checking, simply counting on the network to be what it had always been. The drill concluded. Vlad King reviewed it without the flat effect of someone delivering a performance metric and with the quality of someone who had watched a thing he had spent a year helping to build function exactly the way he had hoped it would function. In the cool-down period, when the class had broken into pairs and small groups for the individual review that followed every full class session, Kendo appeared beside him with the specific quality she had in moments when she had something to offer that required the space of a moment. "You were in the right place every time," she said. "I've been learning the positions," he said. "You've been learning the people," she said. "The positions follow from that. If you know where each person's instinct takes them under pressure, you know where the gaps will be. You fill the gaps because you know the people." He thought about this. "I've been filling gaps since October," he said. "I just didn't know that was what I was doing." "You were learning the network," she said. "You know it now." He looked at the field, at the class dispersed across it in the various configurations of the cool-down. "I know it," he agreed. She smiled, the full version, the rarest version, the one that appeared in the moments of genuine satisfaction with a thing rather than the managed warmth she used for the management of things. He received it with the specific attention he gave to Kendo smiling fully, which was the attention of someone who knows they are seeing something that does not appear often and wants to be present for it completely. "Spring term," she said. "Second half. Everything we built in the first half becomes the foundation for what comes next.